He was called the Immortal King, but his real name was Kang Teha. One day, his rival was the Griffin Guild, of which he was a part. However, he still managed to survive 6 months of non-stop fighting. However, it was on this day that he chose the Griffin headquarters as his grave. But the man did not lose heart. Raising his right hand to his lips to cover his wide smile, he turned to his opponents and said that they were all worthless. After all, they decided to run at him like that, heads down and not paying attention to anything, and he assumed that they would probably get paid a lot of money for it. The angry guild members continued to run, shouting loudly that they had to kill the impudent man, because the killers would get 5 billion gold coins. The first 2 boys who approached Khan jumped high up, swinging their swords to prevent their opponent from casting magic. However, they did not succeed in doing so. Bokang knelt down on the ground, put his hands on it, and shouted loudly that the bone dragon had awakened. And just a few seconds later, a black dragon figure appeared behind the man, illuminated by a bright blue light around the edges. All the people present froze in their seats because they clearly did not expect to see this today. Then there was a burst of blue light in a tall, high-rise building. It was too bright to be seen in the city at night. However, immediately after that, there was a big, loud explosion, during which small particles of the panoramic window flew around. And as it turned out, it was just a dragon that got loose. It flew outside of that cramped, stuffy room, and on top of him stood Khan. He stood confidently, but still struggled to keep his footing against the air that was trying to knock him down. The people who were supposed to fight the gentleman ran outside and watched the bone dragon, wondering how this guy had enough mana to do this. Kana was hanging on with his last bit of strength, so in order to hold on as long as possible, he sat down to gain strength. In those few minutes, the man realized that he had actually spent too much mana to call his assistant. But Khan had no time to rest, because when they flew past the windows of a high-rise building, he noticed something that caught his attention. He was a gray-haired gentleman named E.J. Gui, and he is the head of the Griffins. He was dressed in a gray suit, and his eyes were directed out the window. And when Khan came into his field of vision, the man smiled a little and said that this young man, as always, exceeded all his expectations. For a few minutes, the men stood still in their seats and looked each other in the eye to assess the situation. However, this could not go on for long, because someone called Kang Taha from downstairs. He had to look down to see who it was. And then, just a few meters away from the dragon, an orange laser began to glow, which can damage everything it touches. But then this laser appeared again, but this time it was closer, and it began to worry Khan because he did not fully understand what was happening. Then, just a couple of seconds later, another laser beam hit the dragon's right wing, and it began to scream loudly. So the man suggested that they should go a little higher. Perhaps that is how they could escape from these weapons. However, as soon as they moved up a few meters, the new orange laser hit the dragon directly in the head, and the sharp end went through and out right in front of Khan's face. He was quite surprised by what he saw, and immediately after this successful hit, the animal's body was pierced by several hundred of the same lasers, which left no chance of survival. Therefore, in a matter of seconds, they began to fall rapidly, and they landed on the ground with a loud thud. The head of the guild turned to the squad of holy knights and ordered them to capture Khan immediately, and people did not waste any time in surrounding their victim, who at this time was still on her knees with her head down and not looking around. A few minutes later, the main man of the guild appeared on the low stairs. He leaned on his stick and asked Khan if he would finally surrender. The young man lifted his right arm because it hurt unbearably. He called the other man an old man and asked if he had ever seen him do this before. The gray-haired gentleman replied, smiling broadly, that this had never happened before, but someday this moment must come. After this answer, Khan looked up at the chief and asked with a sly smile why he was wasting his time. The gentleman began to walk slowly forward, leaning on a wooden stick. He said that he wanted everything to go according to his plans. After all, the young man managed to survive where he was predicted to die, and after that, he became much stronger, or so they initially expected. And Khan also surpassed himself when he received a very valuable and important thing. Hearing these words, the young man showed a red stone called the Nameless Stone. When the chief saw this thing, he emphasized that this stone alone was enough for this death sentence. After that, the black-haired man lifted the stone up and asked in a sarcastic tone if the man really wanted it so badly. After all, this young man is not allowed to keep such a thing. because it can do a lot of harm to a person who does not use it skillfully. Hearing these words, Khan threw the gem up and said with a broad smile that he would return it to its owner. When the head of the guild saw this, he was quite frightened because he really needed this thing in his future plans. However, it didn't happen as expected. Khan managed to catch the jewelry and at the same time say that he would never do it because he is not an idiot. The guy added that he remembered how the chief had been looking for it for years, and he offered to get this stone from his corpse because he swallowed it in 1 second. This action frightened and surprised the gray-haired man even more. So, out of anger, he called Khan a freak, the likes of which the world had never seen. Because of this, the head of the guild ordered his subordinates to deal with the insolent man, and they were to do whatever they could to him, as long as they didn't get the stone. When the young man saw that a large number of soldiers were rushing towards him, he decided to quickly use magic. And at the end of this terrible night, Khan died, for he was so young, he was very tired, and could finally rest. Then the events unfold in one of the very unusual rooms. One of the employees opened his mouth and eyes wide in surprise. Another employee began to cry, spontaneously. They clearly did not expect this to happen at all. When the men realized what had happened, they began to run quickly toward the front door, shouting loudly that the young man had woken up. And the young man, who was lying in a small wooden coffin at that time, opened his eyes wide because he did not understand what kind of noise was created around him. This morning, everyone in the town of Chengjiang was talking about how the eldest son of the Baek-un clan had returned to life. However, people did not immediately believe it, because everyone knew that this guy was dead. But how it was possible for him to wake up is still unknown. 2 employees of the main building were talking to each other. One of them said that maybe this guy didn't come back to life but became a walking zhangshi. After all, the deceased used a lot of drugs, so maybe he just fell asleep and looked like a corpse. The younger servant said that anything was possible. The older gentleman warned the younger one to be careful what he said, because Baek-un's men could be everywhere. In the young man's opinion, this clan has not been so influential for a long time. At this time, the guy who woke up sat and carefully examined his face in a small mirror, and he concluded that he had gained too much weight. He used to maintain his muscles with various workouts. Then he remembered that he had heard that this young man was gifted. It turns out that the gifted of the Baek-un Piri clan received alcohol and a bunch of women every day. In general, a fat guy who choked to death in the end. The young man lay on his soft bed and did not understand why he had been reborn into a gifted pig in ancient China. That is why that old man was looking for the stone so fiercely, and right before his eyes, it took away his chance for rebirth, and how angry that made him. After these memories, the young man decided that there was no need to waste time, because he needed to get in shape. When he tried to log in, an error occurred. After all, the player's information from the previous login has changed, and it takes time to log in, and the capabilities will be automatically adjusted. After that, the player's level was downgraded to the first one. After studying the information, the gentleman finally realized that he would not be able to return to his time. To explore the possibility of the stone, he had to die. Literally a split second later, he realizes that there are no monsters here either. After all, he was so tired of lowering these animals. The young man got up and sat on the edge of the bed and began to smile broadly with pleasure. He decided that this was very good news and he could stay in this place. And from now on, he will consider himself Yu Shinun, and no one will be able to find fault with him because he will do a good job in his new role. Then something happened that the young man had not expected, and it made him freeze in his seat with his mouth and eyes wide open. It turns out that 2 men burst into the room. One of them was younger and the other was older. This older gentleman's name is Yu Jin San. He has a great athleticism, and he has long black hair on his head that he grew into a bun. One of the guards fell to his knees in front of this guest and said that the chief ordered not to let anyone in until he fully recovered. However, the man did not like the news very much and was even more angry, so he could not restrain himself and punched her in the face. While the young man was rubbing the place of the blow, looking at the floor, the attacker added, "How dare he speak to him in such a tone?" At this time, the guest said that the black-haired man, though reborn, was still the same fool. He carefully and slowly looked up at his boss and apologized for the situation that had just occurred. After all, the gentleman had asked not to let anyone in. The man who burst into the room began to laugh out loud, saying that it was not like Hen to feel sorry for a servant. As the servant was getting to his feet, the man who came to life quietly asked him in his ear a question to find out who his guest was. The guest then turned to Heng and asked him why he was ignoring him. At this time, another man entered the room with his hands behind his back. It turned out that this gentleman was the leader of the Red Clouds faction. After that, he smiled and said that the guy now needs to be understood and forgiven. An assistant intervened in the conversation and asked Kwok to watch his words as he called the man a lord in front of the gentleman. The revived ones were raging with thoughts that Lord Yu Holyon was their father who died of an illness, and now the position of the local lord is open. The man raised his right hand to his head and began to scratch it. The brother turned to Kwok and asked him to be careful because Hyun was already sick. The revived man stood in the middle of the room with his hands behind his back, looking at his guests, wondering where these freaks had come from. The assistant then turned to his brother, calling him a lord, and told him that they had an appointment with the head of the small clouds. After that, the two of them began to laugh loudly throughout the room. However, the revived man did not like this behavior, and flying up to his guests, he struck his half-brother in the head. He almost fell face first to the ground. The Lord's assistant was quite shocked by this behavior, so he stopped in his tracks and turned his head to the big man and asked what it all meant. However, anger stopped me from asking how the Lord could have missed such a shot. After all, he had been training for many years, and this was simply impossible. But then he realized that the gentleman could not have missed his approach. It is not yet known how he could have missed a blow from a martial arts novice. All this time, the Lord was boiling with rage and anger because he had missed the blow from his brother. So he shouted loudly, "How could he do that?" The revived man folded his arms over his chest and in a calm and serious tone told him to swat his worm. He did not like this behavior at all. However, this did not calm the Lord down. He is ready to draw his sword to attack his brother and immediately deal with him properly for such an act. However, the revived man used magic to help him grow several sizes, and this made the half-brother stand still. And so, several minutes passed in the same position. The man stared at his opponent almost without blinking or moving. The Lord's assistant looked out at the street, which was clearly visible through the open door. When he looked closely, he noticed that many people were gathered around. So, he decided to immediately contact his master and told him that there were a lot of prying eyes here now. Because of this, he needed to calm down immediately. The revived man began to think that these two communicate with the help of thoughts, this transmission of sounds. He had read about it in books about martial arts. The Lord still managed to control himself, so he and his assistant turned to face the door and began to walk slowly. The revived man was looking in the wake of his guests and thinking that they were nothing at all. And then, just in 1 second, the guy got sick. His head started to hurt and he was dizzy. The pain was so sharp that he just couldn't stand it. So, holding his head, the young man leaned on his assistant. The latter was seriously frightened by the attack. He immediately began to ask if the gentleman was okay. At that moment, he began to think that he should have remained a fool and lived like that for the rest of his life. It turns out that it was the voice of his half-brother. He was holding a small flask in his hands and saying that if he had surrendered immediately, this would not have happened. The revived man realized that his brother had poisoned him while he was sleeping, and he did it not only to him, but to their father as well, and they never realized it. So now, more than ever, he needs to concentrate on looking at Yu Shinwun's memories as much as possible. And it turns out that his brother was constantly bullying him. My brother had seen this bastard repeatedly seduce girls who had taken the oath of allegiance, and it made him uncomfortable because it was disgusting. It made him feel very sorry for them. After all, he dreamed that one day everything would work out and they would be good friends. Then the guy began to come to a little bit of consciousness. He began to look at his palm carefully, and his assistant was still asking if he was okay. Only now did he realize what he had done. He simply did not expect this from himself, so he did not attach such importance to it. And the young man sat down on the floor, pulled his legs under him, and began to shake in fear. After all, he had just attacked his brother. The assistant heard only the word "end," but he did not understand what the gentleman meant by that. So he came closer and leaned over to the guy. The revived man turned his face to his assistant and asked if there was a place nearby where many people died. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. However, the young man did not really understand what the gentleman wanted from him. The man who came back to life thought that he had drawn a lucky ticket by being reborn as the firstborn of a wealthy clan. At night, my younger brother was in his house, furious about what had happened today. He even broke the vase that was on the desk. He still didn't understand how this bastard dared to do this to him. How could he do that with only a first level in martial arts? The Lord shouted loudly that he would just tear the insolent man apart. Hearing this, the assistant turned to the people in the room and told them to leave. When everyone finally left the building, the assistant turned to his boss and said that he needed to calm down because they were constantly being watched. The Lord, his face twisted with anger, replied that he could not calm down just like that. After all, this bastard dared to attack him. As soon as the Lord turned away, the assistant began to think that he hadn't even realized that Yu Shinwoon had found his blind spot. But the man decided to reassure his master, so he came up behind him and whispered in his ear that there was no need to worry about the dead man. The assistant told me his idea with a smile on his face. The idea was that Shinun had already died once, so no one would be surprised if he died again. Then the man said with a sneering smile that he would now order preparations for the ceremony to begin, because as soon as that moment comes, everything will be ready. This decision pleased the Lord greatly. He even calmed down a bit and began to smile loudly, forgetting for a split second what had happened today. After that, he stomped his right foot on the floor and began to think that the bastard was just lucky. However, it won't work twice. In the Valley of the Blood Fog, where no one returns alive, this place is avoided by the locals. A man who had come back to life was walking along the road and often stopped to rest. Sweat dripped down his face as he made every effort to reach the forbidden zone. After all, this is the perfect place to level up necromancy, because the place where many soldiers died has strong souls. And right in front of him, bright light began to seep through small cracks in the ground. When he came closer, the boy was upset that he could not take these souls, because he could only take the white ones. After all, he is now on the first level. That's all the young man could do. He put his hand to the ground and asked to stand up. After all, he had no other choice now. Then the system gave a message that the soul corresponds to the skill level. Therefore, in a matter of seconds, the soul of the dead will be extracted. When the extraction of the soul is completed, it will immediately move to the body of the one who needs it. Then, you will increase your rank and skill. And this new ability is resistance to various kinds of poisons. Also, due to psychological shock, the young man can temporarily hear the dead. But this is a problem for ordinary necromancers, because in his past life, he had to go through much worse torture, and nothing terrible happened to him. And when it was finally over, the young man sat in the same place for several minutes and tried to come to his senses. After all, his body was not that well pumped. During this rest, the system gave a message that the maximum experience was gained. The player is promoted to the second level. New skills are unlocked. It's never happened before that this happens in one use of a skill, because before, he had to kill a bunch of monsters to do this. Sitting on the ground, the guy studied all the new information that the system gave out, and he realized that in order to unlock skills, he needed to fulfill the conditions. Then the young man decided to try to use his powers. After a few seconds, he realized that he had enough yang mana but no yin, while the mana was passing through his body. Then the young man felt very painful. It even caused bright red blood to flow from his mouth. The guy consoled himself with the fact that he needed to hold out a little longer. And to do this, you need to focus on something good that brings you joy. To control mana, you need mana circles and a heart-shaped organ. The more circles circulate around the heart, the more mana yin can be contained. After this procedure, the young man leaned back. He took a deep breath and exhaled and said that he could finally rest a bit. However, he still feels hot. Kang Tae-ha, unlike other necromancers, used the heart, not the brain, for his main organ. It was his personal invention that he used. After all, if you concentrate mana in the brain, any mistake will lead to dementia. Mana gradually absorbs understanding and physical functions. And being the only person with the yin mana heart, Kang Tae-ha did not suffer from any of these effects. After resting, the young man decided to use magic. He threw a small orange ball on the ground in front of him and said to the skeleton to appear. A blue circle with different hieroglyphs appeared in that place, through which a skeleton later began to crawl out. He did it very slowly and gracefully. You could see the pleasure on his face because he was smiling. The revived man calmly observed everything that was happening in front of him. After all, he had traveled such a difficult path for this purpose. A few minutes later, a low-level skeleton appeared on the ground. He was holding a sword in his right hand, and a blue light shone on his chest. The guy looked at it carefully, put his hands on his chest, and began to think about the fact that this was his first called-up skeleton. So I decided not to postpone the test until later. I wanted to check how this skeleton would do its job right now, so he made his first gesture. Then a strange thing happened. The skeleton fought with the other one and managed to defeat its opponent. And to rest, he sat down on the ground with his head bowed. However, immediately after that, he simply disappeared. There was only smoke left behind, and he began to wonder if he had run out of it. There is little mana in this world. That is why the dead are so weak here. If he used to get 10 mana of yin from monsters, he would get 10 mana of yang. But there are no monsters or piles of mana here, and there is simply nothing you can do about it. You have to get used to living in such conditions. So, without wasting any time, the young man puts his hand to the ground and tries to get the circle of death out of it. Light began to appear through many small cracks. After this night walk, several days passed, and in the house where the man lived, some things began to happen that he did not understand. Every day he noticed things he didn't like. It was limiting his abilities. Or rather, each time there were more and more guards near his house, and they were watching the house around the clock to make sure that no one else came in or out. He realized that all this was happening because of his half-brother, whom he would not hesitate to strangle if he had the skill of stealth. However, after calming down a bit, the young man turned back to the house and began to walk slowly, thinking that he should not do anything hasty. This time he decided to get inside, not through the door, but through an open window, in order to get some exercise. He could barely pull himself up to put his leg over, and while he was struggling, he was thinking about how he needed to lose weight immediately. After all, it's simply not a matter of having such a hard time every time he exercises. And when he finally found himself inside, he froze in his tracks because he was not alone in this room. And at the end, someone's shadow loomed. Therefore, in order not to give himself away earlier, the young man had to be quiet. However, this did not last long because he decided to activate the mana circle, and with the use of mana, physical performance temporarily increases. Because of this, the young man was able to run across the room with great speed and approach his opponent. The latter simply could not react because he did not expect it. The revived man put his right hand on his lips to prevent him from screaming. However, in a few minutes, the guy realized that it was not some criminal, but his assistant. But he did not understand why he was here. So, he let him go. It took the assistant a few minutes to cough and apologize. The man who came back to life emphasized that everything was fine and that he was here, and he began to tell him everything in detail. He could not believe that Jin-san could order such a thing. The servant looked at his master with a guilty look. He was about to say something he might not like, namely, the fact that the gentleman escaped outside again today. And this is when it can bring him very big problems. However, the revived man put his hands behind his back. He began to clarify in a serious tone what the young man meant. "What do you mean he ran away?" The assistant, shrinking a little from fear, began to say carefully that lately the gentleman had been going out every night. The master was silent for a few seconds as he did not know how to react to such suspicions, and from his servant. Seeing the expression on his master's face, the assistant immediately put his hands up and added that he shouldn't worry because he hadn't told anyone about it. And immediately after saying these words, he waited in silence for the revived man to speak. At the same time, he was thinking that this young man did not seem to be lying to him. When he received no response, the servant again turned to the master and asked him to follow him, and they began to move quietly toward the exit. The gentleman did not yet understand where they were going and why. That night, a full moon was shining in the sky, illuminating everything around. The two men came to a small hut in the woods. When they entered the building, the assistant told the chief not to worry, because the building was abandoned, and no one would find them here. After that, the young man approached a large wooden box, and the lady pushed it away from the wall against which it was pressed. It turned out that there was a small hole in the wall behind him. Pointing to it, the assistant said that it was an escape route known only to servants. He said he would not ask where and why the gentleman was going. After all, he must have his reasons. He suggested that he go, and he would wait for him here. The chief began to tell him that if they found out about what he had told him about this place, he would not be able to escape the death penalty. The revived man began to say that at this moment he could not trust anyone, but he wants to make an exception for this guy. The gentleman then asked the young man if he could trust him as well. The assistant did not hesitate to answer that of course he could. After receiving his consent, the chief approached him and put his hand on his head and apologized in advance for what was about to happen. He used mana to revive him, and the young man's whole head began to glow with purple light. Lowering his hand, the master began to watch the servant, but he did not yet understand whether this was how the charm skill was supposed to work. Then he asked the young man what kind of relationship he had with Yu Jinsang. The assistant began to say in a calm and slow tone that he had no relationship with the man. As he listened to the answer, he wondered if Sharma had such a strong effect. It is possible that the locals do not have techniques for psychological defense. The young man began to answer that when he was younger, he was a very kind and honest man. He treated him like a younger brother. The gentleman began to beat him and treat him badly. But despite this, the young man still believes in him. After all, maybe he will become that good person again. Hearing this answer, the revived man clapped his hands and said that it was impossible to believe in him when everyone else had betrayed him. This is really some stubborn idiot. Then he began to think that all his life he had been treated like a monster, and now at least someone had his back. While he was going about his business, the assistant understood everything and did not ask any questions, so he just stayed here all this time waiting for his boss. Finally, after several weeks of training, the man's level is raised to 10th, and the Yin Mana Heart skill has been upgraded to rank S. Then he began to look at the message that the system gave him. It said that he had acquired 3 new skills at once. However, on the plus side, the Necromancer's rank has been raised to D, and now he will be able to effectively absorb Kai, and this is something he has been lacking lately. Then the boy began to look at the bright light in the cracks in the ground, and thought that the difference between white and blue souls was great. He had already felt this before. And then, a few minutes later, he remembered Yu Jinsang and Chairman Kwok, that it was from them that he felt such a flow. Could this be key? There is very little yin mana in blue souls, but each of them retains great power. And this power depends on one's abilities and personality. Absorbing the blue soul, the guy wondered what kind of powers they held, and maybe he could distill it into the yin mana that he needed so much right now. So I decided not to postpone this chance, but to take it now. And he began to gradually let the mana slip. After a few seconds, he realized that his palm was hot. Thanks to the mana circle, it was quite easy. And if things continue to go on like this, he will be able to easily mix it with yin mana. So he was quite pleased with this. And then the mixing began. However, after a couple of minutes, the guy realized that if he didn't stop, the circle of mana would break. This development infuriated the reanimated man, as he had clearly expected a different outcome. So right now, he would create a new vessel for the mana, and focusing on this, he began to put all his efforts into it. However, he realized that creating another vessel would be quite difficult because it would put a lot of strain on his body, but he needed more energy. The young man again tried to use all his remaining strength to ensure that the mana remained in his body and did not disappear. After several minutes of such tension, the young man managed to do it. So he fell back on the ground and spread his arms and legs in different directions. The revived man was so pleased that he had succeeded in his plan that he just continued to lie in the same position and smile. Then the system displayed a message, and the guy began to study it with his hands behind his head. It said that the second vessel contained a species of Kai. And then he remembered that when you mix many kinds of Ki, something very bad happens. It can just tear him apart from the inside. Next, the boy's attention was drawn to the skill art of floating clouds, so he opened more information about it and began to study every word carefully. Then he turned his head to the right and, looking at the souls wanting to get out of the ground, began to think about whether he needed to do it again. However, he stopped himself because he needed to understand the mechanics first. After all, it was the simplest technique, and he had already almost died. So he first decided to test both mana and Kai at the same time. Stretching his left hand forward, he ordered the skeleton warrior to stand up in a serious tone. When the creature got up and was examined by the young man, he reflected that he had used only mana before because Kai had side effects. Then he decided that he needed to use Kai, and stretching that hand forward, he began to use it because today we need to at least deal with this. And then heat began to spread throughout my body. It was rushing to the stretched through all the organs. The guy could only wait for the result. And then he realized that the mana of yin and ki had mixed with each other, even though he hadn't planned it, and this makes these experiments more and more interesting to him. So he sat down and put his hand with the purple light around it on the ground, and hieroglyphs appeared in a circle, and the young man ordered the skeleton to reappear. Then the young man began to raise his hand up. However, he did not take his eyes off the place where the hieroglyphs appeared, which were highlighted in purple. What he saw in front of him surprised him. The guy froze in his seat with his eyes and mouth wide open. The skeleton was too big and powerful. It made such strange and frightening sounds that the boy did not know what to do now. But then the revived man came closer to the creature and, smiling broadly, greeted him and added that they had finally met. What happened next looked quite strange from the outside and for the guy himself. After all, there were two skeletons on either side of him that he had summoned. The first one was of the 7th level, but the second was several times stronger than the boy himself. So it became clear that using mana alone was not enough. And because of this, the young man made a certain sign with his fingers. And after that, the weaker skeleton began to move with an axe raised above his head, and he was heading for the opponent. Instead, another skeleton was going to respond to this attack, which was clearly several times stronger than him. However, the fight was simply unavoidable. The creature with the blue light, i.e. the weaker one, pushed off the ground and jumped high up to strike his opponent. However, he was not able to hit him, because the skeleton, which was illuminated with purple light, managed to dodge and take one step back. Then they began to move quickly across the lawn, waving their weapons at each other, but it was not yet clear which of them was stronger. In one of the clashes, the weaker man landed on the ground to rest and recuperate. The stronger one raised his sword to the level of his chest. Watching all this, the revived man thought that this skeleton was a very good warrior, and it's a pity that a simple warrior runs out of energy so quickly. Then the skeleton with the blue light gathered his last strength and turned his weapon on his opponent. He did not want to give up so easily. Seeing this, the purple skeleton began to smile broadly. He liked this gesture very much because he also did not even think that it would end there. That's why he rushed towards the opponent. He's just not ready to stand still and wait for an attack and have to defend himself. On the way, he began to use his strength. This was his strategy to keep his opponent away from him so that he could not harm him. The blow hit the skeleton right on the bone. He did not expect that he would not even be able to reach his target, so he was forced to stop in one place. As it turned out later, after this blow, the weaker skeleton not only stopped, but his weapon flew out of his hands, and they froze in that position. Then the stronger man got to his feet and put his sword to his opponent's throat. The latter stood unarmed and was just waiting for his end. The creatures did not finish everything immediately after the order, so the boy had to speak up. After all, they could do a lot of harm to each other. When they finally stopped, the guy used mana to cancel the call, and these skeletons began to return to the ground. Then the system displayed a message saying that he had spent only 10 ki. However, it was clear that mana was not easily restored. Or there is another option that he will simply need to learn a martial art. This requires a lot of effort and resources. The next morning, he told his assistant about his intentions. He was shocked by the news because he had avoided any fights all his life. Rubbing his beard with his right hand, the revived man clarified whether there are any such arts or techniques that allow you to absorb your opponent's kai. The assistant heard these words and began to worry, but he said that one should never ask such questions because it is a demonic art. The gentleman began to think that demonic art. But it's a good thing that the art of floating clouds is a common technique. Otherwise, the problem would not have ended. So he decided not to make his assistant nervous anymore and said that he was done talking. He asked where the Baek-un clan members were learning martial arts. After receiving this answer, the guy put his hand on the young man's shoulder and turned him to the door and said that this is where they would go now. With a big smile, the young man told the assistant that it would not last long, because when he took over this place, all roads would be open to the young man. After that, the man who came back to life went to the library with his hands behind his back. The servant remained in his master's house, waiting for him to return. In 1 second, the young man stopped abruptly and asked his assistant a question to find out who the strongest clan warrior in history was. The young man said that he was Lord Yuil Liang. After he became the most satiated, he passed on his knowledge to the people, break the clouds with a punch. After hearing this, the boy said that he was going to the library. But in the end, he added that it was hard to imagine how strong this warrior Yu Il-bil was. As he walked, he thought that the system was divided into the first, second, and third classes of supreme and subordinate warriors. And he needs to find out how much the strength between the third and the dawn warrior differs in this place. After all, this may be useful to him in the future. Suddenly, the guy's attention was drawn to some strange conversations of people passing by. They were discussing whether he had lost weight. Then these people began to assume that the guy was going to a brothel or a bar again. without stopping for long in one place, the gentleman began to walk to his destination. And with the appearance of the second mana vessel, the young man does everything his body can handle. And he said to himself that he would let these people keep talking. But on the other hand, they play into his hands, because his reputation has nowhere to fall, so he can do whatever he wants. And while he was thinking about it, he had already approached the main entrance to the library. There were 3 guards on duty at this entrance. Each of them had his own sword. The 2 younger ones were quite surprised to see the man who had come back to life, because he had never visited such places before, so they were just bursting with curiosity. When the young man approached the guard, he asked him a question with a serious expression to find out why he had come here. In the first seconds, the thought flashed through the revived man's mind that he must be the boss of all the guards and that he looked like a typical thug. The guard turned his head to the right and raised his right hand to his chin, saying that he thought the gentleman would not find the books he wanted to read here. And then the guard leaned back a little and said that it must be books with a bunch of pictures. The 2 assistants standing behind him laughed out loud. At the same time, the main employee thought that this was his chance, that if he intimidated and destroyed this fat man, Mr. Jin-san would notice him. The guard was shocked to hear such words. The man who had come back to life came closer and told him to finally move so that he could enter the room. He simply wasn't going to waste his time with such impudent employees who could afford it. But the guard did not want to let it go. The man who came back to life was tired of this fuss at the library door, so when he stopped and turned to face the insolent man, he used mana magic. After a few seconds of such exposure, the man removed his hand from his shoulder and calmly continued to move inside the room, while the guard remained. Seeing this, the 2 younger men approached the chief and began to ask him questions. Why did you let him in so easily? What about Chairman Kwok's order? For a few more minutes, the young men tried to talk to their colleague in order to get a few words out of him that would clarify the situation. And more often, the memory of what he saw came to his mind, and these were clearly not human eyes, and he felt the same genuine horror. What happened next surprised the younger members of the clan, then frightened them, and then they simply did not understand what was happening. As it turned out, such a mighty strong and fearless man was hunched over, sweat streaming down his face. On top of that, he had pissed himself. The young men decided that they had to take the man away from here immediately, because if he saw the man come back to life again, he would do more serious things in his pants. But they are still curious about how the gentleman got this look, and it turns out that the rumors are true that he changed after his death. However, he is also the son of a tiger. So this is to be expected. Even though he has the lowest level, he uses his abilities just fine. At this time, in the premises where the main headquarters of the Baek-un clan, namely the Red Cloud Tower, was located, quite different activities were taking place. One of the men, who was dressed in purple clothes and had his long hair in a ponytail, approached the glass door and put his right hand on it. This door opened inside, and behind it was a staircase that led low underground. For a few seconds, the man looked around so that no one would notice him. After climbing several flights of stairs, he found himself in a room where a group of people was waiting for him. They covered half of their faces with red masks, and behind them, on a wooden table, there was a body wrapped in bandages like a mummy, and on the wall next to it was the skull of a large, horned animal. The people who had been here all this time froze in their seats and bowed their heads to the man who had just visited them. This is how they show their respect. After a few seconds of silence, the vice chief of the Red Clouds, Ha Gyum, addressed the guest, calling him a shaman and congratulating him on the meeting. It turned out that this guest was the head of the Red Clouds faction, Kwok Un-san. He asked in a serious tone if they were still doing this. The boy bowed his head and apologized, because these were old habits that had remained with him since the time of the sect. But he promised that from now on he would be more careful. The head of the faction did not answer, but instead said that this Yu Shin-un was able to enter the library today without any problems. The young man replied that this plan was working for now. After all, he was probably scared that he had died and suddenly resurrected. Kwok said he thought so too. Then the red-masked worker suggested that it looks like Yu Jin-sang is completely fed up with Kwok. After all, they were the ones who paved the way for him. The head of the clan said with a broad smile that it was just stupidity not to have limits. That is why they chose him, because he simply does not pay attention to anyone. Then the man raised his right index finger up and said that it was playing into their hands. And this is how the problem will be solved without their intervention. Kwok replied with a sly smile that this could happen, but that he still needed to be safe. So the employee pointed to the table behind him and said that he had come up with something, but that he just needed to finish cooking. Having carefully examined everything around him, the clan leader said, "Great." However, he did not know what to expect from this, so he waited for at least some explanation. However, he did not have time to listen to all this. He decided to blindly trust his subordinates. He turned to the door and told them to start now. Smiling widely, he stood in one place and said that all this was happening in honor of the red sky, to which they have devoted their entire lives. When the leader was heading for the exit, people showed a certain gesture that symbolized their loyalty. They stood in this position for several minutes. It was late in the evening outside the Baek-un clan, specifically in the Cloud Gathering Library. 2 guards stood guard, protecting the building from any attackers. Squatting down, the men began to discuss among themselves that there were no normal books about martial arts left in this library. After all, you can't just learn martial arts by grabbing the first book you come across. At this time, the revived man was looking at the textbooks on the shelves, but he doesn't need their help. It looks like he is just looking at books. In each book, he finds information that he really needs. Then the man closed the book loudly and concluded that because it was a first-class expanded edition, it was of the highest available level. If he circulates his chai together with chaotic or demonic energy, he has a high chance of tearing himself apart from the inside. And if he had more yin mana, it would not contradict the alien energy so much, because now the mana was protecting him from being absorbed by the key energy. 8 hours had passed since the guy entered the library and studied the information from the available books, and he looked normal. And then the system gave him a message that he could study the art of the immovable heart, and my husband immediately agreed to this offer. Suddenly, his peace was broken by a wooden cart that touched his right leg. He quickly got to his feet and began to look at the little girl. The young lady was very frightened that she had failed to watch and had harmed such a gentleman. She froze in place in fear, and tears began to form in her eyes. Instead, the gentleman pointed to the cart with his right index finger and asked in a serious tone what kind of books she had brought, and why was she so scared. The little girl replied that these were damaged scriptures that they would replace with others. Hearing this, the man who came back to life asked to be taken to the place where they kept all these old copies. When they came to the basement, the man immediately began to study the information from the books that were there. The girl sat next to him and looked at him. After reading the book, he asked his assistant to give him the next one. With a frightened expression on her face, the young lady asked if it was possible to study art in this way. Instead, the gentleman said that if she wanted to help him, she could find the best book, and if she managed to do it, he would buy her sweets. When she heard the promise of sweets, the girl said with a big smile that her name was Dan So-yeon and asked to wait a few minutes. The girl quickly ran out of the room and returned a few seconds later, holding a book with a very tattered cover. Taking the book in his hands, the revived man carefully examined it and emphasized that it looked really old, so one could find useful information here. Then the man put his hand on the girl's head. She stood there in astonished silence and waited for the result. The only thing she did not understand was what was happening. Then the gentleman said that the young lady had worked very hard and was working late because of him, so he would buy her as many sweets as she wanted. A few hours later, the gentleman returned to his room. He was very tired today and wanted to rest, but he decided to practice one last time. At that moment, a lot of different thoughts were going through my head. Unknown type of trash. It must be something incredible. High chances that it is a hidden treasure. The lack of combat power can be completely covered by yin mana, and the vessel of mana would replace the knowledge of liberated chi. However, this was a bit difficult for him. However, there is no connection between yin mana and this art, as there was with the art of floating clouds. At this rate, on the 3rd round of mana, he might just tear himself apart. Suddenly, something strange began to happen behind him. He had to stop for a minute to see what was going on. However, something green in color was quickly heading toward him on the floor. As soon as it approached, it rose up and wanted to attack the young man. But it didn't help him at all. Anyway, this green liquid fell on him, and most of his face was smeared. It turned out that not only his face was dirty, but also most of his body. However, the young man continued to sit in the same place doing nothing. When I came to my senses a little bit, I began to examine this liquid, wondering what kind of energy it could be, since it was just instantly absorbed into the body. A few seconds later, the system issued a message that an unknown liquid was recognized and that it was a death curse that was rapidly spreading through the body. Hearing this information, the young man assumed that only Yujin-san could do such a thing, and it turns out that this world is unlimited by martial arts. Then the young man began to think that this curse reminded him of the power of the hunters from his past life, and it is clear that it cannot be recognized immediately. After that, the man began to laugh out loud while looking at his hands. He stayed in this state for several minutes and then said out loud that he was very lucky. Charged death energy is not a curse, but a blessing for a necromancer. And now he has more than enough yin mana to fill the second circle. And if the vessel is very small, he will simply enlarge it. After all, it already has enough strength to do such great things. Then he said to himself that he needed to thank Yujin-san for sending the curse of death. With his help, Yushin was filled with yin mana. For necromancers, a curse is like a blessing, and Yushin did not waste this mana but put it to good use. So he decided to create a third circle around the mana vessel. With his new ability leveling, he was able to do so. After he succeeded, the revived man was already at the level of a B-level hunter, and he was very happy about it. After all, in his previous life, he was swinging much more slowly. In addition, with the increase in yin mana, it is easier for him to combine it with ki energy. The system then issued a message that said the rank of the Eastern Sage's discontinuous art has been raised to superior. Then he began to study what new skills he had acquired, and among them was the art of drifting clouds. And when he finally read everything to the end, he looked up to the window and saw that it was morning, and he hadn't even noticed it. So he got to his feet and stretched his back a bit, saying that he had worked all night but still felt pretty good. But as it turned out, he did not enter, but ran in, saying that the gentleman needed to get ready because he had guests. When he heard the last words, the guy froze in place with his mouth wide open, and then he asked who it could be. The assistant, coming closer, did not dare to say the name of the visitor. However, he still had to tell him, because sooner or later, this guest would enter the room and the gentleman would see for himself. Yushin was shocked to hear this information, to say the least. He had no idea he had a girlfriend, let alone a fiancée. At this time, there was some strange commotion at the main door of the Baek-un clan. The two guards who were on duty that day assumed that the Jean family's carriage was now in front of them, and no one had told them that they were coming. The man who was driving the cart leaned down a little and told the young lady that they had arrived and she could get off. And in just a few minutes, the lady was already in the courtyard, where many clan helpers were waiting for her, and her comrades were standing next to her. When people who were on the square at that moment saw the girl, they stopped to admire her beauty. As she walked into the room, the people were discussing how she could be so beautiful. They speculated that she was sent from heaven. Everyone wanted to get a better look at her because they had only heard about the girl's beauty, but had never seen her with their own eyes. One young man leaned forward so low that he could see the young lady, that he just couldn't keep his footing and fell face first into a puddle. And when he got down on his knees, he began to shout loudly to the whole yard because everyone had just seen his shame. However, when he wiped himself off a bit and was able to open at least one eye, even in his numbness, he saw something that he did not like and was very frightened, namely, that he had stained the dress of a young lady who was passing by. Her bodyguard was very angry and began to ask him menacingly, how dare he do such a thing? Even his apology did not stop the guard, who was about to go up and punch the guy in the face. However, he was stopped by a girl. She went up to the victim and took him by the hand, asked if he was okay and put a coin in his hand, saying that he might need it. After this act, the young lady continued to walk into the room, and people began to discuss that she was not only beautiful, but also a good person. However, everything was not as it might seem at first glance. The girl was very angry that some slob had soiled her dress. At this time, in the premises of the Baek-un clan, namely the Blue Cloud Building, two men were sitting opposite each other in the large hall, with an assistant standing next to them. The half-brother looked at the emperor's chair, which was empty, and then he turned to Kwok and said that if it weren't for Yu Shin-un, this place would have been his long ago. He also does not understand why this young man feels so confident. Does he think his father is still alive? And then the assistant said that the vice chairman of the Baek-un clan, the White Blade Dujin-un, was approaching the room. Everyone present turned their heads to the front door. Next, the head of the Clear Clouds faction, Non Dai Yong, entered the room and pointed to the guy behind him and apologized for being late because his son had overslept a bit. When he heard these accusations, the boy began to find out why he was to blame. After all, it was his father who came home very late. The father turned his head back a little and began to shout loudly at the boy because he did not introduce himself to the vice chairman and another gentleman. The young man was afraid of his father, so he did everything he was told. When everyone was seated at the table, my stepbrother was annoyed that all the people greeted the vice chairman first and not him. But there is one more disadvantage of this Dai Yen. It is simply impossible to bribe him with money, gifts, or women. Pure clouds follow only the stronger ones. Then the thought flashed through his mind that sooner or later they would all be under him. Suddenly, another man joined them. As it turned out, he was the head of the Small Clouds faction. The man seemed very kind and friendly. Kwok addressed everyone and said that until their guests arrived, everyone present could begin the meeting. And then the vice chairman emphasized in a serious tone that there was no senior gentleman yet. The head of the Small Clouds faction said that perhaps it was necessary to start because Yu Shin-un was unlikely to come because he was not feeling well. However, as soon as the man finished this phrase, the door to the room opened and a man dressed in a beautiful suit stood right in front of them. All those present were shocked, to put it mildly, that he did come. No one expected to see him here today, and his brother was the most angry of all. He didn't even try to hide it. Instead, Yu Shin-woon stood by the door for a few seconds and studied the reactions of each gentleman present to understand for himself who was for him and who was against him. Then the guy grabbed his assistant by the hand and started walking with him to his seat. And when they came to the table, he sat him down next to him. People did not understand what was happening here. After all, no one had ever allowed themselves to do this before. And then one of the main factions banged on the table and asked what this man was doing. How could he put a servant in a place of honor at a meeting of the Baek-un clan? The man was so angry that he could not contain himself and continued to scream, saying that no one had ever done such a thing in the history of the clan. The assistant of the revived man was very frightened, so he turned his head to him and said that he really had no right to sit at this table. When the room fell silent, he asked a rather easy question intended to reveal what they saw as such a huge problem here. The gentleman, who had just calmed down, opened his mouth again and began to speak to clarify on what basis he had allowed the dirty servants to share the table with them. Yu Shin-woon calmly replied that he had done it for all the right reasons. He added that, first of all, this young man was his assistant, not a dirty servant. However, these facts did not convince the head of the faction, so he continued to show his dissatisfaction with what was happening. And then the one who came to life could not stand all this shouting, so he decided to use the magic of mana and spoke in a more serious tone to the head of the Small Clouds. And just in 1 second, the man's expression changed dramatically. It was as if he had seen something terrible, and the thought of that look flashed through my mind. Then the gentleman asked a question to all those present, the purpose of which was to find out if they thought that he had to ask them for permission to do this. The man who screamed the most sat silently with his head down. He simply did not make a sound and even blinked less often. The father and son stood there with their mouths wide open because they hadn't expected this young man to be able to show off like that. But my half-brother didn't care because he was only concerned about himself and his plans. He never wanted to get involved in such a showdown. As a result, the room finally fell silent and only a few people looked at each other. No one understood what was going to happen next. This was not enough for Yu Shiwan, so he turned to the one who shouted the most and asked him why he was silent. Finally, my stepbrother decided to intervene in this conversation. He said, smiling broadly, that once in a while you can do this, and the older brother is still not well. Another head of the faction emphasized that the gentleman really surprises with his kindness sometimes. And then Kwok also intervened in this conversation and emphasized that since all the problems had already been solved, it was time to start the meeting. And he began to say that the Gen family had come to them for an unexpected visit. And most of all, they came for 2 purposes. My father interrupted the speech and asked why they wanted to terminate the agreement. And over the years, they have not received any complaints from them. Kwok replied that the family was complaining about their employees and their actions. The only thing he thinks is that the factions of Baek-un are to blame for this. Everyone present looked down and began to think about why this family could visit them like this in broad daylight without even warning anyone. No one even thought about it. After all, it's as if nothing had happened. So all they have to do is find out the purpose of their visit. Suddenly, the head of the Small Clouds faction on the table said that according to information from their spies, this family had begun to meet with the Huangrok clan more often. At this time, the revived man was having a dialogue with himself that these people could have told everything as it was. But no, they are deliberately avoiding this topic. And then in 1 second, my father just exploded, slamming his fist on the table and shouting, "How could they have chosen Huangrok out of all the commissioners?" After that, someone knocked lightly on the door, and the guard's voice said that a young lady named Jen Mai Ho had arrived with her escort. A few seconds later, the door opened, and a sweet, fragile girl entered the room, smiling gently. And behind her was a bunch of men. Lowering her head in a bow, the lady said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and asked how they were feeling and how they were doing. After this question, the room was silent. Everyone just looked at her. The pause was interrupted by his half-brother, who first laughed out loud and then said that everything was great. And finally, he emphasized that she had become even better. The girl blushed a little when she received this compliment, because no one had said that to her for a long time. Fixing a strand of hair, she thanked him. The father, who was still angry, said in a rude tone that it looked like they were in a hurry. After all, they had just been served tea in the room, and they had already come. The guard, holding her chin with his right hand, replied that the room was too small for him, so they decided to go to a bigger one. None of the clan members got the joke, so they sat silently and continued to look at their guests, who were still standing at the door. The girl's bodyguard emphasized that it seems that everyone here has so many problems to solve, so he suggests going straight to their case. After receiving the agreement, the gentleman first apologized with a smile and then said that from now on, the Jen family would stop all trade agreements with the Baek-un clan. When my father heard this information, he exploded again because he could no longer contain himself. He banged his fist on the table and began to shout loudly. Despite these accusations, the guard calmly added that his chief thinks that a clan without a chief is a lost cause. The man then held his hands out to the side and emphasized how they could trust them to manage their commissions in such a mess. The half-brother leaned his head on his arm and asked if this was really the final decision of their head. Could it happen that he would change it? The security guard replied that if this mess got better, he could reconsider his decision. After all, over the years of their trade relationship, they had earned a certain amount of trust. Everyone was just shocked at what they wanted from them in such a short time. After all, they already have a lot of unresolved problems. The head of the Small Clouds faction said in his mind that this abrupt visit was necessary for suppression. It was also a rude threat to get them to elect a clan leader. And surely, Yujin Sang and the Geng family have already agreed. And that's why this show is being played out here now, so that everyone believes and does not resist, but fulfills all the conditions. Finally, the guard pointed to the girl who was upset and said that he would also like to talk about the conversation between this lady and Shin-un. Finally, the revived man joined the conversation, yawning long at first, signs that he hadn't slept all night. The guard said they could listen to everything he had to say. The half-brother began to wonder if this guy hadn't forgotten his love. Then the guy turned his head to the young lady and looked at her carefully. For some reason, after his death, he did not remember that he had ever had a fiancée. As soon as she heard what Yu Shin-woon was going to say, she looked up at him. She didn't want to miss a single word he was saying. And then the young man revealed that he wanted to cancel the powwow. Everyone present was shocked, to put it mildly. Even the girl herself opened her mouth wide. This message surprised and upset the young lady. She drew her eyebrows together and asked how come he wanted to call off the vow, but only a moment ago. Namely, the very moment when the members of Jen's family entered the room. Among them was his future bride. When Yu Shin-woon saw the young lady, he wondered if he had a headache, just like the first time he met Yu Jin-san. And it was uncomfortable. However, thanks to the circulation of yin mana and the concentration of this pain in himself, he was able to subdue it. And someone's voice echoed in his head. It turned out to be a memory from the past, where they first met this young lady. She approached the man who had come back to life and said hello. The next memory was that the girl was very happy and said with a big smile that now we can consider them reinstated. But as it turned out, she was also dating Yu Jin, to whom she told him not to show on the street that they knew each other. There was another situation when Shin-un caught them spending time in his brother's room, and only from these memories did he realize that this girl was just a rotten person. Then something strange began to happen in his head. Everything disappeared, and he just stood in the darkness alone. Looking around, he realized that there was nothing nearby. This strange pause lasted only a few seconds, but it still made him quite nervous. After that, the image of a girl who was very angry and asked what she had done wrong again. And then she said that this group gave their lives for her happiness. The man stood silently watching what was happening. After all, this would help him put all the puzzles together correctly and draw certain conclusions. This lady was being led by 2 guards to a room. She was covered in blood. When he decided to examine the crime scene, there were several bodies of men lying on the floor, and the man who came back to life could not understand what kind of memory it was, and it turns out that this is a memory from the future, which is still far away. And again, the question arises, where does this mind get memories of events that have not yet happened? So the gentleman decided that as soon as he managed to move further up the levels, he would definitely discover the rest of the memories, and he already knows how he can do it. Because of these memories, he wanted to break the silence. And this news was simply unexpected because everyone was counting on such an alliance. While everyone turned their attention to the guy who said some nonsense out loud, the girl just quietly put her head down and cried. And the revived man, not paying attention to anyone, began to scratch his right ear, asking the lady why she was silent. And is she still in love with him so much? The guard was very angry at these words, so he shouted loudly, "How can a gentleman treat their young lady like that?" The father intervened in this fight and quickly got to his feet, pointing his index finger at the guard and telling him to watch his language. He looked out from behind Yu Xinwun's father's shoulder and added that they also wanted to offer it, so he didn't understand what the problem was. The guard thought that if the rumor spreads that the fat man Shint-un refused to keep quiet, the head of the family would cut off his head. The man who came back to life did not pay attention to this reaction. Instead, he put both hands behind his back and said that there were people among them who had long known that the silence could be broken. And after these words, the half-brother and the young lady realized that this gentleman was trying to hint to them about something she had known for a long time but had not shared with anyone. The guard was so angry that steam was almost coming out of his ears. He then called the revived man a bastard and said that he would not let him humiliate himself anymore. So the man decided to use magic. But literally in a matter of seconds, he noticed that this man who had come to life did not even know the basics of martial arts. And he didn't fall on his back in fear, didn't piss himself, didn't even get scared. The guard did not realize what was happening. He was counting on his magic. However, he tried his best to fix something else. He thought that this guy was at the top of his game, so he would soon give up. However, everything did not happen as the guard had imagined. Instead, his magic was overcome by Yu Xinwun's mana, and he was quite shocked by this. Finally, for a few minutes, the room fell silent again. Everyone in the room tried to breathe deeply so as not to do something stupid in anger, because it would be hard later. The head of the Small Clouds faction turned to the revived man sitting next to him and asked him if he should interpret these gestures. And if so, he is ready to fight right here and now. After these words, the man's eyes glowed with blue light, and he began to prepare to use his powers. When the guard saw this, he froze and began to think that these people had not lost their strength, and he decided to fight against the entire Baek-un clan. Therefore, to defuse the situation a little, he put his right hand forward and said in a calm tone that they had no complaints against the entire Baek-un clan. And then, the head of the Small Clouds faction got up to respond to this speech. He emphasized that this was complete nonsense. Then the half-brother said that it was a really difficult situation, and they cannot deny responsibility for their brother's decision. Then you could see in his eyes that he had come up with something quite insidious. Therefore, he said, in order to preserve the relationship of the clans, he proposes to resolve this conflict with a duel. Everyone in the room fell silent for a few seconds after hearing these words. At that time, my half-brother thought that although it was not an ideal time, it was a good situation for some unpleasant incident to happen. The guard, rubbing his beard, agreed to the offer in a few minutes. The young lady began to smile with satisfaction. And then the assistant of the revived man jumped to his feet and leaned on the table and began to shout loudly that this could not be done, because you can't send this gentleman to a duel. The words of this young man were supported by the rest of the clan. They agreed that it would not be a fair match for Yu Xinwun, who had not been trained in this. The young lady's guard did not care. He said with a sneering smile that they were trying to tell him that the young man had just given up. And since he was scared, he can ask the lady for forgiveness. And maybe she will show her kindness and forgive him. After these words, the man who came back to life confidently rose to his feet, and everyone turned their heads to him to understand his intentions. Then he turned his face toward the guests and began to walk slowly toward them. No one had yet realized what this young man could do. Only one half-brother was happy about what was happening around him. After all, he had hoped that his brother would simply lose and keep everything. Yu Xinwun walked up to the guard and looked intently into his eyes. He was studying his opponent in order to recognize his weaknesses. Then the revived man walked past all the members of Jen's family to the door, and they all obviously did not expect him to agree to such an offer so easily. Therefore, they turned to face the door and, one by one, began to step out on the threshold to see what he would do next. Suddenly, the guy stopped almost in the center of the yard. For several seconds, he stood looking in front of him, clenching his fists one by one. Then he began to warm up. He raised his hands up and rubbed certain parts of his body, and only after that, he said that he was tired of them all. After his speech and warm-up, the guy abruptly turned his head back to look at the reaction of the guests, because he was going to show off his abilities today. Instead, everyone was shocked by what was happening. None of the people present expected to agree to such an adventure so easily. Therefore, to finally confirm his intentions, the young man raised his right hand up and clenched it into a fist, saying that he was ready to fight right now. At this time, all the people of the clan were working at their jobs. The day began as usual, and there were no omens that something big was going to happen. The man who was making the weapon told his neighbor that this time he had made a great sword, but the man did not even pay attention to him. And then he disappeared from sight altogether. Then people started running down their street toward the main square. The man did not realize what was happening, and why everyone was leaving their jobs so abruptly and running without even looking around. He also wondered what attracted them so much. Another gentleman who was a neighbor on the right side said that a duel would soon begin. According to rumors, the elder gentleman and the Geng family will fight each other. Upon hearing this information, the man froze in his seat, his mouth opened wide in surprise. As it turned out, they decided to hold the match on one of the grounds at the gymnasium of the Baek-un clan. A large number of people gathered around the stage. One of the clan members approached the vice chairman and said that all this could not go on. It had to stop immediately. It was also impossible that the man chosen to protect Jean was an ordinary soldier. However, his colleagues also didn't understand the fact that the revived man agreed so easily. The vice chairman said that he himself was not at ease, and he was in favor of stopping the fight, but now it is impossible to do so. Because if they do that, all the viewers' hearts will turn away from the older gentleman, and it will be disadvantageous for them. My father began to think that the vice chairman was right. Losing followers among the locals was tantamount to losing the race for leadership. The vice chairman added that he would not stand aside either. After all, if the gentleman is in danger, he will definitely help him, no matter what it takes. And my father reasoned in his head that no one could interfere in the fight until the winner was determined. He was not worried at all. After all, he was 100% confident in his abilities and capabilities. Instead, he could hear the thoughts that were raging in his father's head. Then he began to scratch something behind his ear, looking at everyone around him. An assistant stood on his right side and begged him to change his mind, at least now, because in his opinion, it's just a useless act, which on top of all that, can harm him. He hasn't been alive long enough. When everyone had gathered, the guard turned his head to his opponent and asked him, smiling broadly, if the time had come for them to start fighting. Without hesitation, Yu Xinun walked up to the stairs and confidently climbed up to the stage, saying that he was ready. The assistant was shocked by this decision. The young lady decided that they needed to show their excitement, so rubbing her head, she said sadly, "What happened?" Only one survivor saw her true face, so he advised her to try out for the lead role in a movie. The security guard again intervened in this conversation and angrily turned to the young man and asked him how much longer he was going to humiliate and call her names. The vice chairman turned to the guard and said that since the fight was not taking place in the murine, it was strictly forbidden to use internal ki. Then the guard turned his head back to where his subordinates were standing and, smiling broadly, asked who wanted to go into battle first before the young man. They all wanted to go so badly because if Jen Miho noticed them, their careers could take off. The chief among them did not even doubt that this could happen. But from this forest of hands, only one had to be chosen, and it was O Dal Sen. When the guy was getting ready to go on stage, a security guard came up to him and asked him not to use his inner ki. As soon as the guy started to get up, the man who came back to life expressed his dissatisfaction and asked what he was doing. The guard asked what he meant. Yu Xinwen pointed at the young man and emphasized that he was not his rival, but the Black Bear himself. So he invited him to come up on stage. All the members of Baikon's clan froze in their seats, not even blinking in surprise and shock, because they were already worried about him and he was doing this. Even my half-brother was shocked and opened his mouth wide. The square fell silent because no one knew how it could end. The guard angrily turned to Yu Xinwen and told him not to choose his opponent as he pleased. After all, their strength difference is very large. The revived man, looking up the hill, replied that there was no difference in their strength at all. And finally, he added that the guard did not look strong at all. One guy from the Baek-un clan realized that if they continued to talk like this, they would end up at each other's throats. And with a wave of his hand, he said that the fighters could begin. On the battlefield stood Yu Xinwen and the guard's subordinate, who had already begun to prepare for the attack. The boss mentally told his subordinate that he would take care of everything later. Therefore, the young man may not hold back and destroy his opponent. The revived man didn't need time to warm up. Instead, he spent those first minutes studying his opponent and seeing his weaknesses. And in a few seconds, a warrior was jumping on the gentleman, mentally apologizing to the young master for what he would do to him today. However, Yu Xinwen managed to dodge in the last seconds, and so it turned out that the attacker missed, even though, according to all trajectories, he should have hit the target. Everyone watching from the outside was shocked by this development. After all, no one expected this from a young gentleman who had never studied martial arts in his life. The guard's subordinate did not give up and tried to strike again. But this time, he failed because his opponent managed to take a step back. This development made the opponent very angry, and he began to quickly shake his fists at the revived man. He no longer knew how to approach him, and Yu Xinwen managed to dodge each of them with a wave of his hand, and it was not difficult for him. So far, he hadn't even done his best. The guard did not like the way his subordinate was fighting, so he turned to him angrily and shouted at him to fight as hard as he had to. Realizing that his opponent was stronger, the young man realized that he would not succeed at this rate. And then people noticed that this subordinate was going to use martial arts against an ordinary person. When the revived man had nowhere to retreat, he realized that the boy had pushed him away on purpose. And having used the mana, he quickly began to run at the opponent, saying that now he would cleanse his stomach. The members of the Baek-un clan saw what was happening on the stage and realized that this trick was dangerous. And as soon as the impact occurred, the men glowed bright purple. The guard was very pleased with this course of events. However, what happened next was very confusing. Namely, he saw his subordinate sitting on the stage and holding his hand, the palm of which was severely burned. The half-brother of the man who came back to life was also shocked and did not understand how this was possible. He had expected his brother's defeat. Did he put an iron plate or armor under his stomach? But this simply can't be, because before that he was moving around the stage very freely. Kwok told his master that it was a defensive art, and his half-brother asked him when he had time to learn it. As soon as the victim was taken away from the battlefield, his superior said, "How could the gentleman allow himself to use art?" At this point, Yu Xinwen was thinking that he had gotten very bored with this man today. He was also interested in the name of the protecting art. This accusation also angered the people, so everyone started shouting that this soldier had been the first to use it, and that their lord was only defending himself. And he hadn't even used his inner ki yet, so everyone unanimously began to ask the guard to take back his words. And because of this, the man had no choice but to accept that they were defeated in this round. Then the man who came to life raised his right hand up to demonstrate his victory, and his fellow villagers at that moment simply burst into applause. But during the attack, he used the mana of bone armor, which protects all human bones by covering them with stronger and larger ones. However, this joy was interrupted by a security guard who, climbing on stage, decided to clarify that the duel was not over yet. And so now it was his turn. The vice chairman said that this was impossible because a chosen martial arts warrior could not fight an ordinary person. And since the young gentleman is not a simple man but a martial arts master, there will be no problems in the battle with him. A member of the Baek-un clan was categorically against this fight taking place. This verbal argument was interrupted by the revived man, who said that it was a waste of time. And turning to the guard, he said that for a man, he talks a lot. Then he pointed a finger at him and told him to get his iron ass to the center of the stage. When the two men were facing each other, the guy who was in charge of the fight said that they could start the battle. Hearing these words, the guard began to stretch his arms and said, with his eyes bulging, that his opponent would regret what was about to happen. And the revived man said, in a calm tone, that for some reason everyone loses after this phrase. At this time, the guard's thoughts flashed to the idea that he looked overconfident. And it looks like he's too confident in his martial arts, but it will be easy to break him. And to do this, you need to use more strength. So the man began to move quickly toward his opponent, but he failed to hit him because he dodged. The guard did not give up and continued to wave his hands from side to side, trying to hit Yu Xinwen. Dodging each one in a wave of his hand, the revived man thought that this man was quite agile. But he's not going to be on the defensive all the time. After all, it can last for several hours, and he is not interested in that. So he grabbed the guard by the arm and twisted it in the opposite direction so that he began to fall to the ground. However, he was so experienced that he was able to stand even on one leg and swing the other to strike. When the vice chairman saw this, he realized that something very dangerous was about to happen. And as soon as the guard's foot touched Yu Xinwen, there was a large burst of orange light. But as it turned out later, the attacker did not hit the target, because the guard prevented him from doing so by covering his face with his hands from the blow. It was hard for the Gen family worker to believe that he was unable to strike. However, he did not give up and continued to wave his hands rapidly because he believed that sooner or later he would succeed. Dodging the hands of his opponent, the revived man emphasized that this one fought in a completely different way, although the tactics were similar. The people who watched this fight with their mouths wide open began to discuss whether this man was the chosen warrior. Another group of people suggested that in their time, the Gen family took in just anyone. And do they really take in people because of their large size? At that moment, the guard was out of his mind with rage. After all, he had already spent so much energy, and it was all for nothing. However, he did not even think about giving up. So he pushed off the ground again and began to attack the revived man, shouting, "What kind of tricks are these?" When he landed next to his opponent, they stood there for a few seconds, looking into each other's eyes. And then Yu Xinwen decided to use Yin Mana because he was tired of fighting like a child. You need to diversify it all. He punched the guard right in the face. The guard closed his eyes in surprise and froze in place. The young gentleman did not hesitate to strike again, but this time in the chin. And he was so strong that this 100-kilogram man. And then he lands face first on the other side of the stage. And the revived man raised his right hand up to demonstrate his victory, and gritting his teeth with joy, said out loud that it was quite easy. When the people saw this, they also exploded with joy. Everyone started jumping and raising their hands in the air. Finally, someone in their clan had appeared to protect them. The guard lay there for several minutes, but over time, he began to make coughing sounds, but he did not get to his feet because he needed to gain strength. Eventually, he decided to get up. And when he did, he looked around and realized that what he was so afraid of had happened. He was so angry, first at his opponent and then at himself. After all, he should have realized that this could happen. When he turned his gaze to Yu Xinwen, he saw him standing very confidently. It was as if he already believed in his victory, and that made the guard even angrier. But as soon as his emotions overwhelmed him, he quickly jumped to his feet. He slammed his hands into fists on his legs and called his opponent a bastard. And immediately after these words, a bright red light began to appear around the man. And in a matter of seconds, he jumped out of his seat and ran right at his opponent. As soon as he approached Yu Xinwen, he waved his hand and said the phrase, "I hope you die." But this did not scare the young gentleman at all. And when they collided, there was a very large explosion that blinded everyone around with its light. People instinctively raised their hands to their eyes. The young lady of the Gen family also covered herself a bit, but she still tried to see what was happening with one eye, because she was very curious, like everyone else. However, what she saw next frightened and surprised her at the same time. She had expected some unexpected development. And what exactly did she see? The fact that as soon as she opened her eyes fully, she saw the large body of her bodyguard flying towards her. In the last seconds, the young lady managed to take a step back. Her assistant was landing loudly right where she was standing. And on the stage, in front of Yu Xinwen, stood the vice chairman. He was holding a sword in his outstretched hand, and from the expression on his face, one could understand everything. As soon as the guard was able to get up and sit on the ground, he noticed that the man was holding a white blade, and he was shocked that it would end this way. Instead, the vice chairman turned to his colleagues and asked them in a menacing tone why they were still standing around. After all, someone was trying to kill their boss. And finally, he added that this was not a request, but an order for everyone to stand up for their lord. After these words, all the men of the clan present surrounded Yu Shin-woon from all sides. Members of the Clear Sky faction are forced to surround the enemy. After all, he should not go home quietly after this. He needs to be dealt with like a man. Hearing these accusations, the young lady bowed her head guiltily. The guard gritted his teeth, and the other members of the clan were worried that they would all be killed here because of this idiot. However, what happened next was something that none of those present had expected, namely, that an angry young lady began to shout loudly that they had dared to point their swords at her. The warriors of the Baek-un clan began to smile sarcastically, emphasizing that they had seen her true face. These words made the young lady even angrier. She was alone in this situation, and no one stood up for her, and she was the one experiencing such terrible emotions. So all she could do was walk up to her bodyguard, who had been representing her interests just a few minutes earlier, and slap him hard. The head of the Pure Clouds faction, watching this scene closely, turned to Ms. Jen and asked her to hand over this thug to them. After all, they have every right to make him pay in blood for the attempted assassination of their senior lord, because no one can afford to do that. However, an unforeseen situation happened again. When the guard realized what was about to happen to him, he was shocked that it would happen today. He was attacked from above by a man who hit him and caused drops of blood to appear around him. The guard's subordinates wanted to help him. After her surgery, the woman lifted and turned her head to the Baek-un clan and asked if this would be enough to finally end this showdown. The leader of the Silent Clouds faction was shocked by what had just happened. All he could say was that the woman was a ghostly bloodclaw. The other members of the guild began to talk quietly among themselves about how this was the bloodclaw of Gyu Nam-san, who was also the strongest warrior of the Gen family. The vice chairman was thinking that his martial arts were at the peak of the intermediate level, but even that would not be enough for the young man. But he would not back down. Then he turned his head to Yu Shin-woon and asked him not to worry because he would protect him, because they have to stand up for each other. Instead, the man who came back to life came closer to his defender. He said that who else would protect anyone, and the man needs to worry about himself. The vice chairman did not like this suggestion. He tried to help the gentleman, and the latter, in turn, simply humiliated him in front of everyone. He felt insulted. Then everyone turned their attention to the young lady who had killed the guard a few minutes earlier. She defiantly began to lick the sword she had used to do it. Then the head of the Pure Clouds faction approached this man. He stopped a few meters away and began to look at this monster with his head held high. Instead, the woman first laughed out loud and then said that if they wanted to start a war, she would not stop them. But the half-brother intervened in this conflict and appealed to the head of the Pure Clouds and asked the man to step aside. However, the chairman was so angry that he continued to say to the gentleman in a rude tone that he did not seem to understand what was happening. The half-brother pointed to the members of the Gen family and said that the actions of these people were understandable. Besides, there was no point in fighting anymore. And at that moment, he was thinking that everything was not going according to his plan. Because if something happened to Gen Miho or the other members, Gen's family could cancel their agreement. However, the members of the Baek-un Guild still did not understand how this young man could understand their actions. They demanded that he explain himself to them immediately. However, literally in a second, Yu Shin-un, who was standing behind everyone, waved his hand from side to side and said that these guests could really be released. Hearing these words, everyone turned to face the gentleman and demanded an explanation for his decision. After all, they were prepared for the worst, but not for this. After taking a deep breath and a long exhalation, the revived man replied that everything was really fine, and this incident can be a good lesson for guests on what not to do. It took a while for the guild members to be convinced. After all, this had never happened in their life experience. So for several minutes, they stood there almost without moving. People who were still standing on the square, because they were also curious about how it would end, began to think that this gentleman had just almost died, and they became very interested when he managed to learn how to use ki mana. After all, it hadn't been long since he came back to life. Everyone had long since realized that something had clearly changed in the gentleman, but no one had yet figured out exactly what it was. However, they liked the gentleman very much. At that moment, his half-brother was furious at what was happening around him. After all, everything was not going according to the plan he had come up with a few days ago. And what made him even angrier was that he realized through a certain connotation in Yu Xinwun's words that the phrase learning a good lesson was referring to him. However, these thoughts were interrupted by a young lady from the Gen family who angrily shouted that she would never forgive the man who had come back to life. After all, this young lady was poking at him with her right index finger. She also had a strange grimace on her face and a reddish tint to her skin. Immediately after saying these words, she turned sharply in the opposite direction and began to walk quickly to the exit, with family members following her. Then the events unfold on a clearing in the middle of the forest, where there are several stone statues that were carved in the form of animals that are located on columns. And literally, in a matter of seconds, two groups of people dressed in strange clothes appeared simultaneously on this lawn from two different directions. The first group wore large straw hats. They used them to cover their faces from all strangers. The second group of people was dressed in a completely different way. To be more precise, they had masks on their faces, through which only their eyes could see the wine. The leader of the first group turned to the leader of the second group and angrily asked how it happened that their plan went to hell. The masked man first apologized and then said that no one could have known that the situation would turn out this way, although the instigator is already dead. As it turned out, the leader of the first group was the half-brother of the revived man. He was very upset that everything did not go according to plan. The masked gentleman squinted his eyes and said that their leader had made a decision, and if they allow it, they would like to draw their swords right before the moon. This request took him by surprise. He did not expect everything to unfold so quickly, so he had to think it over and weigh the pros and cons. Then he turned in the opposite direction and told the second group to start with the Moon family, and he would remove the guards and dogs from the main gate. After this conversation, everyone quickly went about their business, and it happened so suddenly that a large and thick cloud of dust stood on the lawn for several seconds, and in a matter of seconds, a purple patch of liquid appeared on one piece of land, which at first slowly moved in the places where people were standing. It took this liquid quite a while to find out. After all, this is what it had come here for. That's why it tried to cover every centimeter of the ground. At that time, while in his room, Yu Xinan heard the conversations of the guild members. They were saying things like this: he was really able to bring back the Gen family's black bear? Then an assistant entered the room and said that the head of the Pure Clouds and the vice head wanted to know when the revived man would come to meet them. On top of that, the vice chairman of Clean Clouds, Non Kyung-ho, also asked for a meeting in the near future. The assistant began to clarify what had happened and whether the man needed anything now. The man replied that everything was fine, but he was just thinking about what had happened. The guard began to speak more loudly about how things were not really like that. If the vice chairman hadn't saved him, he would have been in big trouble. Then the assistant sat down at the table and nervously began to tell me that when the gentleman said he would fight that monster, the revived man rubbed his nose and began to smile sweetly, thinking that his own brother wanted him dead, and this young man was so afraid that he might die. The man decided to calm his friend down, so he looked him in the eye and apologized for making him so worried. The revived man began to smile broadly, emphasizing that the young man was not his servant, but his reliable assistant. He can always count on him. Then the young man got to his feet and began to walk slowly toward the exit, saying that the gentleman was probably tired and could rest. The revived man looked at his friend and said that he would do so. He himself was happy that he could satisfy a person so easily. As soon as the assistant went out the door, Yu Xinwun began to look out the window for something. It was as if he was waiting for someone or something. He sat there for a few minutes in this state of anticipation. Then he stretched his right hand forward and focused his gaze on what was approaching him. Finally, everything was working out for him in the best possible way. As it turned out, this purple liquid that had been wandering around the lawn, where the two groups were meeting, returned to its owner. And it turned out to be a man who had come back to life. As soon as this liquid was in the room, the guy placed it on the desk right in front of him. After all, this is the best place for it in this room. Then the young man turned to the shawpot and asked him to show him what he had seen. The liquid suddenly rose into the air and began to hover in front of its master's face. In a matter of seconds, it grew in size. It became so big that it could barely fit in the room. Then some silhouettes and drawings began to appear. Later on, you could clearly see two people in the group talking to each other about how their plan had gone to hell, and they were deciding what to do with the ball. After watching everything, the revived man praised himself for having put a shadowy whisper on his brother a few days ago, and because of this, he now has a lot of information. And it turns out that in about a week, Yu Jin-sung will remove all the security, and a group of mercenaries will try to kill Yu Shin-woon. But after a few minutes of calming down, the young man realized that he shouldn't do this, especially when making such decisions on emotion. So when the guy opened the window and saw that the moon was already rising, he realized that it was time to implement his plan. After all, nature itself gives signs that you need to act. The thought that this week would be very fast and very productive for him began to reassure him, and when the moon took its place in the sky, the young man realized that it was time to go to the cemetery. After putting on his work clothes, the man was already in the Valley of the Bloody Fog in about 10 minutes. He stopped at a clearing and began to apply mana. He didn't keep us waiting long, and as soon as he heard his name, he immediately appeared on the spot where he had been drawn on the ground. However, this caused him some discomfort. The revived man stood in a very confident pose, with his head held high and his arms folded across his chest. He addressed the newcomer in a commanding tone. Having carefully studied the information, the man realized that the strength of this skeleton was already an indicator that he had reached the top level of the Hunter B rank. Then Yu Shin-woon was pleased that he was able to summon 5 first-rank skeletons in just one day. He hadn't been able to keep more than 3 before, and this is not to mention the effect of absorption of any power and purification obtained from the art of the Eastern Sage. The guy realized that he was very lucky to be able to easily learn the art of tearing. Because of this, he could easily absorb any Kai of the dead. And because of this, he had no problem pumping up both magic and melee combat at the same time. And perhaps he can learn other martial arts that do not affect the mana heart. However, after stopping for a few minutes, the young man began to think it over and said to himself that he did not need to give up necromancy, but to continue practicing it. So for today, he's done with the first class of dead, and we can move on to the Supreme Warriors. It will take some work, but there is no other option. Then he approached one of the graves, and it seemed smaller than he had imagined. For a couple of seconds, he just stood there looking at all the details on it. Then he came closer, and a white light began to appear around the grave. The young man said with a serious expression, "So, this is how we met." After that, he opened his eyes wide and began to say that this is the grave of the first lord of the Baek-un clan, who is considered the strongest warrior in the history of the clan. And he is also a dead man of the highest rank with the highest martial art, and he gives off a golden light. But this grave gives off a completely different color than it should. So the young man wondered what secrets Yu Il-liang was hiding. To find out, he used the magic of absorbing the chi of death. After all, it turns out that everything is not as simple as with ordinary skeletons of the first rank. Here you need to spend much more of your strength and energy. At one point, however, something strange happened. The light began to spread throughout the clearing, even though it was supposed to be directed at the hand of the man who had come to life. And in a few seconds, everything disappeared. And the young man looked at his palm and began to wonder what had happened. Why had the magic of absorption ended by itself? Then the system displayed a message that the necromancy rank was not enough to absorb the death chi of the selected dead person. This made the young man very angry because he didn't know about it, and was already dreaming that today he would be able to work with stronger skeletons. And it turns out that Yu Il-liang was much stronger than the highest level of martial arts. The man who came back to life was curious to know how strong this man was. Turning in the opposite direction, the gentleman began to walk, thinking that there was probably a hidden secret that could help solve this problem. So he will try to find the grave of another supreme warrior, and with her, he will try the magic of the key of death. If nothing happens even then, he will need to raise his rank. However, as soon as he started walking in the opposite direction, something rather strange happened behind him. To be more precise, light began to appear from the grave. In a matter of seconds, it was spreading so that it was hard not to hear it. So he stopped in his tracks and listened to the sounds. Without realizing who it was, Yu Shin-woon turned his head back to see what was happening behind him with his eyes, and what he saw surprised him. He did not understand what was happening here, because a red circle with hieroglyphs began to form around the grave, and the man assumed that it could be the skeleton's call. After that, the system began to issue a whole bunch of new messages. Trying to read them all, the young man concluded that the dead man had decided to join him. These reflections were interrupted by the sight of a skeleton standing over the grave. It was dressed in exquisite clothes of the time, and on his belt hung a warrior's personal sword. Then again, the system began to display messages like this. The servant's rank is much higher than your necromancy rank. The servant is automatically adjusted to the owner's level. To put it mildly, the guy is shocked to learn that almost all of his abilities and skills are A rank. This even includes supreme fencing and 12 swords. Then the skeleton began to walk towards its owner, who is Yu Shin-un. And the young man noticed that this skeleton does not kneel as a sign of respect. When the skeleton came very close to my face, I mentally said the phrase, "What an interesting fellow." A bright blue light shone around this servant. When I received this message, I immediately realized that these were the thoughts of the supreme swordsman Yu Iliang, and he decided to rise from the dead rather than respond to the call. Then the skeleton slowly raised its right hand and placed it on Yu Shinun's heart and said in a mysterious and quiet voice, as if the boy was calling him. Looking at his new servant, the young man wondered if he could handle him. Would he have the strength and understanding to do so? They spent several minutes standing opposite each other, looking intently into each other's eyes. In this way, they studied each other, and a certain kind of transmission took place. To be more precise, the skeleton is trying to pass on the 12 swords of thunder and the art of the god of lightning and thunderstorm to Mr. Yu Shin-un. However, this could not be transferred without Yu Shin-wun's consent. It took the young man a few minutes to realize whether he needed it or whether it was better to refuse and leave it at that. However, you can't take a step back once you've achieved this. So, of course, he accepted everything with pleasure. This way, new horizons for his work open up. This late in the night, in another part of the forest, a gathering of hired killers was taking place, running forward at breakneck speed. Today they were practicing this skill. During this run, they must make almost no noise so that no one can hear them. This skill must also be well honed, because if not, it dooms them to death. The one who ran first stopped abruptly and turned to his colleagues and said that they needed to take a break. They had already been training for several hours in a row. All the members of the group of hired killers stopped at their places at the order of the leader and began to rest, because they were really tired for today's evening. However, they did not have a chance to rest properly, because in an instant a young lady with red hair appeared in front of them again and called them idiots. She even came up to one guy personally and kicked him in the ass, saying that he was too slow and he needed to train even more. The leader of this group of mercenaries, in order to distract the young lady from the personnel, asked her if it was necessary for the young lady to follow them. And then the girl replied that their training was over and the mission to destroy the opponent was about to begin. And she personally wants to see how he will suffer. The chief among the mercenaries began to think that the young lady had already annoyed him with her control. The girl was furious that they hadn't been able to find out about it earlier, because what happened when she met Yu Shin-wun hadn't happened then. The speech was interrupted by a strange sound and a bright green light. The girl instinctively turned her head in the direction of what was happening and froze in place, waiting for an explanation. The leader of the group of hired killers said that it was time to stop this useless conversation because it was time to hit the road. The young lady agreed to this proposal. Then the chief turned to his subordinates and ordered them to prepare for the next trip. They listened carefully to the order and began to gather their belongings and weapons. As soon as they had walked a few kilometers, something strange caught their attention. They all froze in their tracks and began to look around. One of the mercenaries spotted something in the bushes and told everyone that an ambush had been set up for them. So all the troops immediately took up combat positions. The leader of this group quickly ran in front of the young lady to protect her in case of an attack. After all, she belongs to the influential family they work for. One of the mercenaries hit his opponent. This guy was standing a few meters away from the lady, and he could have easily hit her. It scared the girl quite a bit, and then she covered the steering wheel in shock. The guy who was wounded started coughing loudly and heavily. He was also shocked by what happened. When the mercenary leader approached his victim, something caught his attention. Namely, the fact that the hilt of the sword was made of bone. And in a matter of seconds, swords began to fly at the group of mercenaries one after another. Some of them hit the target, some were deflected. The guys did their best, to protect the young lady who came with them, and only then did they think about protecting their own lives. Having developed a certain concept, the chief among the mercenaries first called them bastards and then told them to concentrate key mana around the blades. Immediately after this order, many subordinates did as they were told. A bright purple light appeared around one of them, and then, in general, he seemed to have a great deal of strength. And having directed it in the right direction, he began to skillfully deflect the bones that were flying at him and his colleagues. After this fight, many mercenaries were slightly injured, and they could not fully defend the young lady who was standing behind them. Only those who were not wounded and those who were good with weapons remained near the lady. The main one came to the front and addressed the attacker. Yu Xin-woon first began to lift up the branches of trees that completely covered him, and this is how he managed to be invisible. He said that, how could this impudent man call him a vile person when he was the one who ran to kill him? Then the guy stopped a few meters away from the group of soldiers. When the mercenaries' leader saw their attacker, he was initially shocked because he hadn't expected Yu Xin-un to attack them. The rest of the mercenaries were also wondering how this guy could have ended up here, and the one who came back to life asked them why they were silent. It was as if they were biting their tongues. Then the young man began to walk forward. A few steps before the attackers, he raised his right hand and pointed to the guys in turn and said their exact names. When the guys realized that he was 100% right, they froze in their seats in shock, but it didn't scare the boss. Then the boss decided to get a little tricky and said that they were on a secret mission from the Gyeong family. Yu Xin-woon didn't believe it. The young lady mentally decided to tell her defender that Yu Jin-song is a bastard who betrayed them, and the attackers shouldn't stand still because this guy knows everything. The chief emphasized that the two brothers were able to deceive them. That's why they shouldn't make a premature attack. Someone should be with this guy because there were too many bones to pick at once. But no matter how much he looks around, he can't see anything strange. Therefore, in order not to expose himself to even greater danger, he needs to wait a little longer. However, it was hard to think that he came alone. After all, he wasn't stupid enough to take such a risk. At this time, Yu Xin-woon yawned loudly, and the chief among the mercenaries continued to think that this gentleman must have left a bone-shooting machine behind him. So the attacker decided not to waste any more time, but to act. And with his arms outstretched to the side, he began to say to the revived man that he couldn't wait for his death or something. Looking down at his opponent, the gentleman replied that everything was actually going according to plan. After all, whatever they had imagined and thought up, everything had happened as it should. All the mercenaries who were feeling well prepared to attack Yu Xin-un, one of them even said out loud, "I hope you have a good time in the afterlife." And the revived one used the magic of bone swords. It made it possible to shoot many sharp swords at once. The young man enjoyed this course of events, and in a few seconds, these swords appeared and began to move towards the attackers. But in order to choose the exact direction, the young man had to point in that direction with his index finger. As soon as the guys saw that such a large pile of swords was coming at them again, they stopped in the places where they were at that moment, because fear controlled their minds. Some swords again passed them by, and some hit those who failed to dodge. One of the mercenaries called Yu Xin-un a sorcerer. After all, he did not use his body and its capabilities to win. He was fighting from a distance. Hearing these words, the revived man smiled with satisfaction and said that he had not even started yet. He had not even used half of his skills and strength. At the same time, the thought flashed through my mind that this skill requires much more energy. Therefore, you need to use it carefully. And the chief among the mercenaries was thinking that it could not be that this young man was using Kimana to start all this, but he could not be a supreme warrior at that age either. And most likely, the demonic sect is somehow connected with the fact that Yu Xin-un was resurrected. So these thoughts made the man very angry, and he shouted loudly throughout the clearing. And then I began to think that this revived man must have some kind of weakness, and they just need to find it and press it. The other mercenaries began to talk among themselves about how this gentleman had caused them a lot of problems and ruined all their plans. But there are still many more of them. Therefore, they think they can win with the help of numbers. In addition, the number of bones that were flying at them decreased slightly. So they decided that if they ran at him in a crowd, they could kill him. Then a loud order was given that everyone should move from their seats to the enemy's side. However, as soon as they began to move, the revived man, smiling broadly, told them that he had not come to this fight alone. When the head of the mercenaries heard this phrase, he managed to stop on the spot and ask again to clarify what the gentleman had just said. Then the gentleman stretched his hand forward, palm down, and turned to the skeletons of the soldiers and ordered them to stand up. And then the attacker realized what was about to happen. So, staying in his seat, he began to cry because he already knew what was coming. The other gang members gathered around each other and began to ask each other what it was that appeared in front of them. As it turned out, skeletons began to crawl out of the ground in front of the revived man. There were quite a few of them, and they were all illuminated in blue. After the newly arrived warriors took their positions, Yu Xinun folded his arms across his chest and said that this is what is called demonic art. When a group of hired killers saw what was appearing in front of them, they began to utter phrases that spoke of their surprise and fear. They saw not only ordinary skeletons of warriors, but also a supreme warrior standing in front of them, glowing with blue light. At this time, the main mercenary thought that he had been a killer all his life, but even he froze in fear. Then the man's attention was drawn to a young man from his group who abruptly turned in the opposite direction and was about to leave the battlefield. However, he was unable to do so because his superior fatally wounded him, explaining that he would kill anyone who tried to escape. The rest of the guys began to raise their weapons up, shouting loudly that they could handle these bones. Their motto today is all or nothing. And immediately after that, everyone began to run quickly toward their rivals. Surprisingly, there was a lot of confidence in their abilities at the bottom. The skeletons saw that the attackers were coming and prepared themselves to enter the battle with dignity. After all, this is what they came here for. Yu Xinun stood calmly aside with his arms folded across his chest. He was quite surprised that this group of impudent people had decided to get into a fight. After all, they had so many chances to just run away and survive. But no, they chose the worst possible scenario. While running, the attackers held up their sticks, which they were skillful with. They had prepared them so that as soon as they approached the opponents, they could strike them. The skeletons prepared weapons for themselves. These opponents were so focused on the battle that they did not even pay attention to anyone. And as soon as they got on the field, they immediately began to fight each other. Each chose a worthy opponent and fought with him to win. Suddenly, the mercenaries froze in their tracks because what they saw in front of them surprised them again and forced them to make quick decisions that could affect their lives. As it turned out, in addition to the skeletons of the warriors, wooden arrows were also flying at them, and they had to defend themselves. This made the battle even more difficult. One of the young men managed to destroy an arrow that was flying right at him, and he was already glad that he was able to avoid injury or even death. However, as soon as he turned his head forward, he saw something that made him freeze in place, almost without moving, with his eyes wide open. It turns out that the next arrow hit him right in the head. This hit sent drops of blood flying in all directions. The young man could not stand on his feet and began to fall on his back. It landed right in front of the head's feet. He looked at the victim and realized what was happening, and even he was scared of what he saw. The head of the mercenaries had seen this before. An archer shoots 2 arrows in the same direction. The first one distracts the enemy, and the other one deals a fatal blow. And then the man realized that this creature could use the technique of No Jun Moon, the best marksman. It was hard to believe. But the main one didn't want to give up so easily, so he began to examine each skeleton and its manner of fighting. In one, he noticed 19 yang chain strokes of the ghost of a one-sided sword. He is quite skilled in this art, so no one can escape from him. The other skeleton uses the black tiger fist, which is an iron tiger fist technique. It also delivers quite strong and devastating blows to its opponents. And in the end, the man realized that these skeletons were using the techniques of Zhejiang martial arts warriors. This also scared him because he did not expect it to be so serious. So he decided that if he attacked the skeletons, he would not achieve anything. That's why you have to act not as everyone expects, but as the circumstances demand. And with that, the mercenary turned his attention to Yu Xinun, who stood at the end of the clearing with his arms folded across his chest. The man noticed that he was no longer drawing his swords from his bones. The attacker thought he could kill the man with a single blow. He was so confident in his abilities and capabilities. That's why he started running straight at the man. As soon as Yu Xinun saw this, he simply waved his hand, and the attacker could not even approach him, let alone scratch him. Then, the mercenary's attention was drawn to what was happening to his right. He gritted his teeth and looked over to assess the extent of what had happened. As it turned out, There was an explosion not far from them, which threw the attacker several meters back with its blast wave. The landing was quite painful and loud. When the man tried to get to his feet, he realized that it was the technique of the swordsman lord of the Baek-un clan. After all, many of his people have already died, and those who continue to fight do not have much strength to stay alive. Then the strongest skeleton of all came to the fore, and behind him was Yu Shinwun, who began to glow with a bright red light. At this time, the thought flashed through the mercenary's mind about how he was able to fall into his trap. He put himself in harm's way to lure him out. That's why the attacker stayed where he landed. But his posture was very strange. More precisely, he bent low to the ground with his arms outstretched. Then the man turned to Yu Shinwun and said he had to thank him for making the last moments of his life so much fun. And in the last seconds, he opened his mouth wide and began to scream loudly and then laugh. From the outside, it looked quite pathetic because he was not used to such behavior. When the whole concert was over, the man who came back to life realized that everything had gone better than he had expected. That's why a joyful smile appeared on his face. He also liked the lightning effect of the 12 swords of the god of lightning and thunder. In this case, it came in handy at the right time. From now on, he can take martial arts training more seriously. After that, the system issued a message that a new servant was available for conscription. This news made the master very happy, as he got another supreme skeleton. Thinking about this, the revived man began to walk confidently toward the young lady who was still standing on the lawn and wondering why she could not make any movements with her body. When the guy came up to her, he first took off his mask and assumed that she was under the influence of the Shadow Link skill, and that's why she couldn't move. Then she added that she would never even try to kill him. After all, they were in love. After the last phrase, small drops of tears appeared in the young lady's eyes. After a short pause, the young lady folded her hands as if in prayer and said that they could still start over. But for that to happen, they both had to want it. With a serious expression on his face, Yu Shinwun said that the person he was talking to had an incredible talent for acting. And if we talk about acting in more detail, the young lady did not know that the boy had such information. Therefore, the thought flashed through her mind that he should die, because if this secret was revealed to the people, she would definitely be finished. For such unforeseen situations, she always has a small flask of poison gas in one of her sleeves. While the gas was spreading around, the young lady thought that all the worst that could happen was behind her. And that's why she said the following phrase, "Who's fatter than who?" However, from a cloud of smoke, the revived man said that his resistance to the poison had increased significantly. The girl froze in her seat because she did not expect it to happen that way. Then the young man managed to break through and form a small ring through which he put 2 fingers of his right hand forward. At this point, he had a light, wide smile on his face. He then gently placed these 2 fingers on one of the collarbones of the interlocutor. The girl was very scared, so she tried to defuse the situation again. Instead, the revived man said that there was a thing in the world that he adored, and with this gesture, he managed to block her mouth so that she could no longer speak. Then he put his index finger to the young lady's lips and added that he didn't need to think about the law before killing scum like them. Then the young man touched the young lady's chest again with his index finger and used magic to accelerate the decay because he did not want to wait long for the result. Immediately after these words, dark blue spots began to appear on the girl's body. Rubbing each spot, she fell to her knees and looked at her wounds in shock. Looking at the girl's body, Yu Shin-won thought that he had only used this skill before to get rid of the corpses of large monsters. Then he slowly came even closer and crouched down next to the body and began to gently reach for the victim's right arm, which at that moment was stretched out above his head. After that, the guy began to take something out of his inside jacket pocket, saying that he could now take advantage of the situation. As it turned out, he put a wooden pendant next to the victim's face, which will symbolize something for the one who finds it. And so other people will be afraid to do something against the authorities. Immediately afterwards, the gentleman got to his feet and walked out onto the road, leading to his place of residence. Everything that happened today made him very exhausted and angry. So, going home, the man who came back to life said that Yu Jin-sang would be the next one, and he would not be able to avoid responsibility for what he had done. A few days had passed since that fight. There were small, secret meetings at the estate where he was furious because he did not understand how this was possible. Then he jumped to his feet and leaned his hands on the table, looking around and angrily emphasizing that why was everyone silent? So one of the assistants decided to clear things up by sending messages, and he began to say that a group of hired killers had disappeared without a trace. Another assistant added that given that a plaque with her name was left there, they suspect that it was Jen Mi-ho's body. After analyzing all the information received, Yu Jin-sang said that if a nameplate was left there, the person who did it was preparing. A few seconds later, the guy gritted his teeth in anger and said that it looked like the pig had left him a threatening message. So he told his assistants that it was time to stop sitting around and take action. They reassured him that he had nothing to worry about, and then they suggested that he go to the red light district and have a drink there and relax. After all, he doesn't look good, and he won't last long at this pace. However, they told him this with the use of magic. After all, with a normal mind, he would not have agreed to go on vacation when he had so many problems. So, under the influence of magic, the man turned to face the exit and said in a calm tone that he needed to go and have a drink. And he started walking around the room to go outside. As soon as the gentleman left, the assistants began to talk among themselves about how they still couldn't believe that this Yu Shin-un was causing them so many problems. Instead, the older man emphasized that a taut string is easier to break, and the man began to say that if this lowlife interfered with the main plan of the sect, they should destroy him. After these words, the younger man smiled slightly. He liked the way the other man was thinking, and the thought flashed through his mind that the Baek-un clan would soon drown in its own blood. Kwok added that the sect can start preparing for the Holy War, and they will start a bloodbath on the appointed day. Finally, the elder added that the concentration of the curse on Yu Shin-wun should be increased. It needs to be made more deadly. Having listened carefully, the younger man smiled broadly again and said that they would do everything in the best possible way. And because of this, the man could no longer worry. At this time, some strange meetings were taking place near the estate where Yu Shin-un lived. At first, his assistant came out and said that what they wanted was simply impossible to fulfill. However, this did not stop people from asking to meet their best lord, at least for a minute. Instead, the assistant put his hand forward again and said that the young gentleman had issued an order that he would not receive guests for the time being. As people were leaving the meeting place, one of them said that he had been turned away by a dirty servant, and if he had met Shinron for even a minute, he would have taken that place as well. The two men were talking not too far away, and the assistant heard the whole conversation. The assistant, smiling nervously, said that he would soon go crazy. A few days ago, his master told him that he would be gone for a couple of days and he could hide it from everyone. When someone comes, the assistant should pretend that Yu Shin-wun is in his room. The young man was very upset by this errand. He even began to cry as soon as the man who came back to life walked out the door, because he had given him too much responsibility. It turns out that Yu Shin-wun went far into the Rocky Mountains to gain more strength and improve his skills. One day, however, he was visited by a dark green liquid. As soon as she got close to her husband, she conveyed to him with her very being all the information that had happened during all those days while he was away. Rising to his feet, he called his enemies bastards, who were getting angry because things didn't go according to their plan. But it was also just in time because he needed yin mana. After receiving it, the man smiled happily and said that thanks to them, he was full of yin mana again. Next to him in this cave was the body of a dead wild boar. Stretching his right hand forward, the man used mana magic to command the skeleton of the killer to rise immediately. The magic immediately began to work on the body, and it gradually began to decompose until only one skeleton remained. Yu Shin-wun stood in his place and closely watched everything that was happening, because if things did not go according to plan, he would need to intervene and stop the transformation. Seeing what he was facing, the guy raised his hand to his beard and slowly rubbed it, thinking that perhaps all supreme skeletons should have black bones. And then the memory of Yu Il-liang's appearance came to mind, because it was he who had seen this coloring. And then a new question arose. Who was this skeleton? Having carefully examined his creature, the young man folded his arms across his chest and said, "Even though he's a skeleton, he's still unpleasant." But before that, he turned to a skeleton named Gyu Nam Sayen and asked him to give him his martial art, because since he had already summoned it, he had to take at least something. And then the system issued two messages that the gentleman did not immediately understand, and they were as follows. You have fulfilled the conditions for receiving a hidden task. One of the conditions was that the dead man agreed to give all his strength if the gentleman gave him his hand. Yu Shin-wun didn't like this, so he used magic to show the skeleton its place. It didn't take long for the magic to work on the skeleton. Of course, he did not count on such a development because he thought that the man would immediately agree to the condition. Instead, the revived man began to smile sarcastically when he saw that his magic was causing discomfort to the summoned. He should also think carefully about his impudence before the man kills him. In the meantime, he will call the other skeletons and ask them for their martial arts. As soon as the new skeletons appeared, the reviver immediately asked them for their martial arts. The young man began to smile broadly because now he could get the martial art of any skeleton simply by completing its task. Therefore, approaching the newly arrived skeletons, he waved his right hand in front of them and said that their first-level martial arts were useless to him. Finally, he asked them not to look at him so disappointed. After all, he had already received all the martial arts he needed at that moment. However, a few minutes later, he abruptly fell to his knees, dropping his sword to the ground. All these trials exhausted him, and he was not getting enough rest. Clearing his throat, the young man said that he realized that his body was letting him down, and the first thing to do is to lose weight. He said something to the revived man in his own language. The man replied that he was trying his best, but that he was not doing so well. After saying that, the guy reached for his sword and picked it up. Then he brought it up to eye level and, taking a deep breath and exhaling, said that he would try again, but more slowly because last time he had done everything quickly. Holding the weapon tightly with both hands, the young man looked at it with concentration, saying what he was using. First, it was the mana of yin, and then the key of the Eastern Sage. Next, he used the art of the God of Lightning and Thunder Key Thunder. Immediately afterward, a bright blue light appeared around the sword. Then the young man raised his sword up, and lightning began to fly in different directions. He said with a serious expression that this was the first form of art. After that, he said that the next thing he would try would be a thunderbolt. And taking his sword even further behind his back, Yu Xin-un took a stronger swing and struck the ground with his sword. However, after this blow, no effect occurred, and then the young man realized that there was a very big difference in strength between Yu Il-liang's martial art and Gu Nam San's. These thoughts were interrupted by something that scared him a little. He even froze in his tracks because he did not expect anyone in this place to touch him at all. When he turned his head back to see who was touching his back, he saw a skeleton assistant with black bones. As soon as the revived man turned his head forward, he felt fingers moving very quickly on his back. And turning my head back, I saw the face of a skeleton in front of me. He was quite concentrated on something, and an orange light shone through the holes of his eyes. So the young man sat down on the ground, put his hands on his knees, and remembered that when he used to make mana circles on pressure points when he practiced martial arts, he did not use some of the points. And it turns out that at every point Yu Liang pointed to, the guy did not open his mana circles. And maybe that's why he can't do what he wants to do. Next, Yu Xin-un undressed to the waist and decided to try to open each of them using the opening key of the Eastern Sage. So he closed his eyes and concentrated on the task. And the system began to give out a bunch of notifications that he had gained a deep understanding of skill 12. He stayed in this state for several minutes, and as soon as he opened his eyes, he was pleased with the result, because new skeletons became available to him and they were ready to be called. All this time, a skeleton assistant with black bones was sitting behind him, and in his own language, he said something to the young man. Late in the evening, Yu Jinun's estate was to host a tea party with one of the guild's maples. He was already waiting for his master, sitting on the floor in a lotus position with his eyes closed tightly. Without wasting time, the man practiced to improve his skills, but each time he felt more and more pain, which was hard to bear. However, there is another problem. He also has an unknown source of other pain that constantly causes discomfort, and since he does not know where it is located, sitting in such a comfortable position, the man said that his time had not yet come, because he needed to stay here for at least some more time. These thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, and the man opened his eyes and invited the visitor in. It was Chairman Nan, who immediately noticed that the man seemed to be getting worse. The gentleman held up his right hand and smiled sweetly and said that it was probably because he had missed dinner after training. When Nan sat down comfortably at the table, he raised his eyebrows and emphasized that the gentleman himself knew that he had overdone it in the duel. And this is what happened. After saying these words, the man began to think that there was no point in blaming his opponent for this. After all, he would have done exactly the same thing in his place. The man went on to say that the gentleman had left 3 days ago and asked if Nan was worried about him. The gentleman replied that of course he was, and that he was ready to be in charge of their expedition. However, what he knows for sure is that the young man will return home completely healthy. However, there is one more decision that the interlocutor had to make. The older man thought about the question he was asked, and even after several minutes, he did not give a single normal answer. This time, he chose to remain silent. So the guest continued the conversation himself, saying that he also doubted the older man. After all, his sudden change in character may seem temporary and may already bring even bigger problems. Moreover, the older man himself understands that it takes a lot of strength to defend the city. The Red Clouds faction is already strong enough to resist all the others. The elder closed his eyes and began to think that these words were true. After all, the younger gentleman and the Red Clouds would seize power in the clan if the opportunity arose. During the meeting, and after the fight with the Black Bear, he was too self-confident. He showed it to everyone around him, even though he hadn't been like that before. And his appearance reminds us of Lord Yu Ho-ele, whom they all miss so much. He was an extremely kind man and a skillful and courageous leader. These reflections were interrupted by a guest who abruptly rose to his feet, loudly leaned his hands on the table, and shouted that the intentions of the Red Cloud faction were clearly known. Suddenly, the front door to the room slowly began to open. At first, the audience could only see a hand, but then they noticed the person who came to them. After all, at the door was Yu Xinyun, who was smiling broadly and waving his hand in greeting. And then he emphasized that it was very good that they were both here. The two men began to slowly rise to their feet. They clearly did not expect to see the older gentleman here. After all, they had just discussed his negative changes. They quickly approached the guy and bowed to greet him and said that if he had warned them about his visit, they would have prepared snacks. Then he passed these two and, laughing loudly, emphasized that he needed to lose weight. This news surprised the audience a bit because they had never heard it before. The younger guest was thinking that he had heard such rumors that this gentleman had locked himself in a room and would not come out. But it turns out that it was all a lie. When everyone went deeper into the room, the younger man asked Yu Xinwun where he had been all this time. He was curious to know the truth. The young gentleman, with a serious expression, said that he had a lot of personal business that he was not obliged to enlighten everyone about. And he said that now there is a more important issue that needs to be resolved. And he immediately asked how long they were going to play this comedy. Hearing these words, the men were quite surprised. And out of surprise, one of them asked what the gentleman meant. But their bodies showed that they understood exactly where he was going. Yu Xinwun folded his arms across his chest and turned his head to the older guest again and told him to stop using his ki because he might die from it soon. After all, the young gentleman realized after the fight that something bad was happening to this man. But he doesn't show it to everyone because he doesn't want to be written off as a member of the guild. So the man decided to reassure the revived man that everything was fine. It's just that this ki energy is taking him a little longer to recover this time than usual. These words alone did not convince the young gentleman, and he emphasized that if it were true, it would be very good. And so the man is now on the final straight to the other side. The younger guest could not stand it and shouted angrily that Yu Xinwun was watching what he was saying, because he was the one who had brought this man to this point. To calm down, they all sat down at a large wooden table. Next to the elder was a man who had come back to life, and looking at him carefully, he said that this old man was very lucky. The young man folded his arms across his chest and said that if he had not come to check on him now, he would have died by tomorrow morning. The senior member of the guild still could not believe all these words, so he didn't say anything and just sat there with his mouth wide open in his seat, almost motionless. And at that moment, the man who came to life put his hand on his shoulder and smilingly told him to relax and then trust him because he came to help him. After that, they all moved to the floor, with the vice chairman sitting down first and Yu Xinun behind him, who put both hands on his interlocutor's shoulders and began to use mana magic. Just a few minutes later, the older man began to cough loudly and spit out thick, bright red blood on the carpet. The younger guest, who had been silently watching everything that was happening around him, was seriously afraid for his colleague and asked the young gentleman to stop. Instead, the revived man opened his eyes for a few seconds and looked at the younger guest with his stern gaze, demonstrating that he should calm down and wait a little for the result. The man understood without a word and slowly began to kneel down to take a comfortable position on the ground. He did not know how quickly it would end. Yu Xinun continued to use various types of magic, and after receiving some information, he could not understand how such an old man could keep it to himself for so long. And if he had come a little later, there would have been nothing to do. And he remembered that during the duel, things didn't look as bad as they are now, but it was there that he used a lot of key mana. The boy wondered why this old man and Wang Sam were doing so much for other people and not thinking about themselves at that moment. So then Yu Xinwen put his hands on the elder guest's back and mentally asked him to hold on because he was going to pull out all the evil that was in him. And as soon as he is done with this, he will add some of his energy to restore circulation. This is what a man needs to continue living. A few minutes later, the vice chairman began to breathe normally, and then his face changed completely, and this is a clear sign that the revived man has succeeded in his plan. The younger guest, who had been sitting across the room all this time, saw the changes with his own eyes, and he began to wonder how the young gentleman managed to do it. At that moment, Yu Xinwen realized that his experience with the old man had helped him. He had never thought that a necromancer like him would ever use healing, and in a matter of seconds, he removed his hand from the victim's back and said that everything was ready. The man suddenly opened his eyes, and a blue light spread from his body throughout the room. When the man saw it himself, he was very surprised. He could not even say a word because of this. He sat there silently looking at himself and what was happening around him. The younger guest realized a few minutes later that the vice chairman's chakras had opened, and he just shouted this to the whole room because it had never happened to anyone before. But then he realized that the vice chairman had managed to raise his rank at the same time, and that is why now there is a blue light around him, and he looks great. As soon as it was over, the man quickly ran up to the vice chairman and first congratulated him, and only then asked, what was that, and how was it possible? However, he never received any answer, because then they simultaneously turned their eyes to Yu Xinwen and wanted to hear an explanation of what had happened. But we also had to wait for an answer from him because he was still sitting with his eyes tightly closed and not paying attention to anyone. He was too focused on his thoughts. After all, it was the first time in his life that he had ever done such a thing, and he had spent a lot of energy on it. Then the young man began to smile broadly without opening his eyes, thinking that when he absorbed the curse of Dojin-un, he opened the fourth circle of mana and finished one quest. Suddenly, these thoughts were interrupted by a man's voice addressing him. When the man opened his eyes, he saw the rescued vice chairman. The man thanked us for saving him. But the younger guest wondered how the man had found out about the poison and how he had managed to cure it. Finally, they both asked him to explain everything to them because it had never happened to anyone before, so they were curious. Yu Xinwen said that he knew about the poison. The interlocutors reacted quite sharply to these words. However, the gentleman began to explain in a calm tone that, to be more precise, it was not poison, but a curse that someone had cast. The vice chairman said that even if it was true, how did Yu Xinwen find out about it? The guy replied that he wasn't the one who found out first. He had just heard about it. Saying this phrase, the young man changed in his face. He became somehow angry and irritated. A younger guest with a wide-open mouth asked a question to find out who had told the young gentleman about it. The boy turned his gaze to the one who asked the question and answered with just one short word, "Father." Hearing these words, the men opened their mouths in surprise, saying that this could not be true. They began to ask the young man if he was sure of his words. With both hands on his chest and a serious expression on his face, Yu Xinwen told the guests that he was 100% sure of this because his father was killed by the same curse. I gritted my teeth and asked the vice chairman who was behind it, because this cannot happen without punishment in their clan. The young gentleman continued to sit in the same position and said that they had not guessed who among their acquaintances was capable of doing this. The younger guest came close to the man who had come back to life and said that this was terribly important information. He asked why he hadn't told everyone else about it. The man looked closely into the eyes of his interlocutor and said that he could trust 100% of those present at the meeting. Then Yu Xinwen began to tell me that when his father found out about the curse, it was too late. And because he didn't want to ruin his reputation, he eventually gave up. The solution was to find a legend that their family had forgotten. The interlocutors unanimously asked about the legend. They wanted to know more about it. Then the revived man began to slowly take out his sword, saying that it was only by a miracle that his father managed to find its power, which would allow him to destroy everything in his path. Immediately after saying these words, the young man pulled the weapon forward, and lightning began to shoot out from it in different directions of the room. When his colleagues saw this, they began to say that it was the dragon Zijian hidden among the clouds. The younger one added that as soon as the clouds touched each other, thunder would strike the whole world. A couple of minutes later, tears began to flow from the vice captain's eyes in two streams. They were tears of joy, because in his old age, he had managed to see a legend. The young man continued his story that when he received the 12 swords of thunder, the first question that came to mind was why so much equipment had been forgotten by the Baek-un clan. Instead, there are rumors that he wanted the Baek-un clan to follow the path of a trading clan rather than a fighting clan. Thus, the art of the 12 swords of thunder remained a beautiful legend, and the fact that only the revived Mr. Pretender to the throne was able to learn the 12 swords of thunder. This is the main argument that only he is worthy of becoming the leader of the clan. Then the guy turned his gaze somewhere into oblivion and apologized to Yu Hoel for taking advantage of his death for the sake of his story. Yu Shinon then promised that he would repay him for his help in full. Namely, he will deal with the person who dared to hurt him and his sons, who did not deserve it. At this time, the vice chairman bent his head low and wept bitterly because the Lord had to free himself from the curse to work harder. The younger guest also bowed his head and wept loudly because he would spend the rest of his life, and even after death, he will continue to atone for not believing in the master. The young gentleman got to his feet and said that before he told them about his proposal, he needed them to understand something. And did they say whether they agreed to it or not? The men looked up at the same time, but tears continued to flow from their eyes. They waited with their mouths wide open for the story to continue. So when Yu Shin-un saw them ready, he immediately used his magic. To do so, he needed to concentrate on his body and skill. That's why he closed his eyes, and a small purple circle appeared around him, and then different rays of light began to hover around him, demonstrating his power. When the guests saw it with their own eyes, they were surprised to say that it was the art of the god of thunder and lightning. But they still did not understand where such wild energy came from. Then the young gentleman opened his eyes and began to think that this could be really surprising because he was simultaneously applying the mana yin art of the sage and the art of the god of lightning and thunder. The younger guest, continuing to observe closely everything that was happening in the room, asked if this strong man was really the same older gentleman. The vice chairman replied that he had personally seen such strength only once, and it was a soldier who accompanied them to the commission about 30 years ago. And that warrior was the current leader of Murin, Dam Jong-un. He is considered the emperor of the sword. Therefore, a logical question arose. Are their forces now equal? Then these reflections were interrupted by the revived one, who turned to Vice Chairman Do Jin-un and head of the Pure Clouds Non Dai-yong, and said that he would not give long speeches, but would say everything directly. So, looking each of them in turn intently in the eyes, the boy invited them to join him. It would be good for them and for him, because together they would be able to do more good things. The vice chairman immediately fell to one knee and said that he would immediately agree to be the first follower of the gentleman. Then the young man swore that under the leadership of the young Mr. Yu Shin-un, the Baek-un clan would rise to heaven again, and their people will live even better than they do now. Then the revived man asked the men to get to their feet. He said that he would like to congratulate them on their recovery and their union, but that he was more concerned about something else. So without explaining anything, he pushed himself up from the floor and flew high into the air. The guests, who were standing nearby, froze in their seats from surprise. At this time, the young man reached the ceiling and simply pierced it with one hand. You could tell by his expression that it didn't hurt him at all. Then he pulled someone down from the mountain and threw them to the floor, and then he slowly and carefully began to descend himself. All this happened so suddenly and quickly that not everyone present realized what had happened. When the revived man landed on the ground, he began to examine the man he had found, saying to his colleagues that it looked like an intruder had come downstairs. The vice chairman approached him and raised his head, and Non said that the man was using a covert surveillance technique that hides even from the most developed senses. Taking off his mask, the vice chairman recalled that the attacker was a member of the Red Clouds, and he could not understand how he could dare to do this, because they had known each other for almost 10 years. In a few minutes, Yu Shin-un approached the mercenary and told him to go back to his master and tell him that he would soon visit him and wring his neck for such actions. But then the killer's mouth began to foam rapidly. Non went to him to save him and get more information from him. But it was too late. After all, this young man had poison hidden between his teeth in case he was caught. Then all those present simultaneously turned their heads toward the front door because there was some kind of commotion behind it. For a few seconds, they tried to figure out who it was by the voice, and then each of them thought about their own plan of action. They had not yet worked together to do it together. Each of them was used to defending himself. These thoughts were interrupted by Yu Shinun, who grabbed his sword and slowly but surely walked to the door and said that it was better to tell the person who came about everything that had happened. And as he continued to walk, he did not look around, but concentrated on looking forward. And behind him, his new allies were walking with their weapons. At that time, a showdown was taking place on one of the streets of the town, to which Sangbong was the first to arrive, immediately attacking the assistant and threatening him with his sword. However, he did not care about the consequences and what might happen. So without hesitation, he swung his sword and dealt a fatal blow to his opponent. At that moment, he was driven by emotion and anger, not common sense. You could even see it in his eyes. There was no pity or fear in them. After this act, he looked at the rest of the opponents and said in a serious tone that they should drop their weapons and surrender because he could not vouch for his behavior. Another group of men with their weapons was very frightened by what had happened. So the main one among them said, "How dare these people pull out swords and threaten with them on a common territory?" Sanbon was enraged by this question, so he said again that he would not repeat his conditions because they had to surrender right now. One of the rival men sharply clarified that the entire Red Cloud's faction had gone mad and now allowed themselves to commit such lawlessness. However, it had no effect on the attackers. They were not even going to stop. After these words, all the members of the faction picked up speed and began to move quickly toward their opponents. Those who were going to be attacked did not fully understand what was happening. After all, everything was fine yesterday, and now their colleagues and friends are just attacking them. It was out of self-defense that the head of the Pure Clouds faction had to order his subordinates to come to combat readiness, but they would not attack. And just at that moment, the two factions of Pure Clouds and White Clouds united to make everything go for the better. When members of the Red Cloud saw this, one of them said it looked pathetic. After all, they are only first-class soldiers who cannot even defend themselves. As soon as everyone took their places and prepared their weapons for the battle, there was a pause for a couple of minutes, in order for someone to be the first to step up and start the battle. During this hustle and bustle, the two main men went out into the yard and did not realize what was happening around them. Another man came up behind these men and asked if the warriors of the small clouds had decided not to participate in this action. After all, it looks quite beautiful from the outside. One of the chiefs immediately asked the newcomer what his soldiers were doing. A member of the Small Clouds faction wondered if Yu Jin-san had really decided to organize this massacre just because of such rumors. A member of the Red Clouds faction squinted his eyes and asked if they really doubted them. After all these people are enemies who plan to remove the younger gentleman from his position. Another man pointed to the battlefield and said that there could be innocent people among those people, and in the end, they are their family. And then he added that everything could have been much easier if he had just followed their orders. But he never did, and instead, always had his own say. Therefore, the angry man grabbed both of them by the throat and lifted them above the ground, pressing them against the wall. This did not allow them to breathe normally, and they were coughing. Suddenly, they were saying that they could not escape from the hands of this attacker, and all they could do was hope for a good moment to escape. As soon as the man saw that his actions were causing pain to other people, he joyfully shouted for them to die and not to interfere with his plans. When the victims no longer showed any signs of life, the attacker threw them to the ground and said that all the warriors of the Small Clouds were just silently watching their leaders being ruthlessly strangled. Then the insolent man turned his head to the rest of the group and emphasized that it looked like they were the same miserable rodents as their leaders. Then the man took a favorable pose, holding his weapon in his hands, and seriously suggested that they pretend to have at least a little honor and try to fight him. Suddenly, the attacker's attention was drawn to a voice addressing the soldiers of the White and Pure Clouds and asking them not to let up and to hold on to the end. And as it turned out, Yu Shinun and his allies arrived at the battlefield. Nan was already swinging his sword with concentration from side to side, destroying his opponents. He was so angry that he didn't care who he fought. The main thing to do was to win. When people saw a group of 3 important people, they immediately began to wave their hands in joy, and then they all said aloud that their leader had arrived. Others said that an older gentleman had come to help them. For now, the three men stood in a pile and tried to understand what was going on and what they should do. The head of the Red Clouds sneeringly looked at the newcomers and said that he had sent the strongest warrior. Neither Non nor the vice chairman would be able to handle him. Then the attacker raised his hands to chest level and said that considering all that the young man had done in such a short period of time, the vice chairman was very angry with such words and threats, so he first called his opponent a bastard and then asked, "How dare he talk to the gentleman like that?" The man didn't answer, because at that moment he was thinking about the fact that these scoundrels from the small clouds had decided to join Yu Shinun and help him in everything. Then the revived man began to point his index finger at his opponent, who, smiling mysteriously, said that shouldn't his master be held accountable for this? This fact made the head of the Red Clouds very angry. He opened his mouth wide and began to shout loudly. What kind of curse are we talking about? Yu Shin-won was not at all frightened by this. He continued to smile lightly, saying that it would seem true if he went down to the Tonelli dungeon under the Red Cloud faction. And then the attacker changed dramatically in his face. He was quite surprised to hear this information. Members of other factions have not yet fully understood what we are talking about. What Tonelli tunnels? What the hell is this? What does this have to do with father and son? The thought flashed through the young gentleman's mind that thanks to the shadowy whisper he had sent after their clan, the boy already knew all their secrets. Seeing such readiness, the leader of the Red Clouds pointed forward with his right hand and ordered his subordinates to destroy everyone who would come across their path. One of the men of the small clouds turned to his colleagues and told them to stand up for their brothers. And immediately after these words, everyone clashed in battle. Everyone was waving their weapons, trying to inflict at least some wounds on their opponents. The leader of the Red Clouds decided to attack Yu Shin-un, so he pushed off from the ground and began to fly at him, saying that he was going to kill him right now, and that would be the end of it. And while he was flying at his opponent, he began to use Ice Kai. He drew his sword in time to deflect the blow that was aimed at his head. The head of the Red Clouds, smiling slyly, began to think that the opponent had reached the peak of his capabilities. Then he is just an idiot. He doesn't even realize that he's trapped in his ghostly frost. But even after a few minutes, nothing happened. Instead, Yu Shin-won smiled, holding his sword with both hands, which were uninjured and able to move normally. The attacker couldn't understand why the young man was fine, and he asked himself, slapping his sword on his palm, if that was all? The opponent began to think about how this bastard had such a strong internal ki, and Yu Shin-won concluded that compared to the energy of the dead, it was just kindergarten. The head of the Red Clouds was seriously angry and therefore tried to attack the revived man again, calling him a freak, the likes of which the world had never seen. The young master immediately decided to use the 12 thunderstorm swords of the first form, and the first thing he could use was a direct thunderstorm lunge. When the attacker was approaching and saw what was going to be used against him, he realized that it was a rather dangerous blow. But there was no point in stopping, because as soon as he was close to Yu Shin-won, he grabbed him by the bars and told him that it was too late to do anything. Then the revived man struck a blow that, in the first wave, severed both of the attacker's limbs. One of the Red Clouds began to scream loudly because what happened to him caused him terrible pain. At this time, Yu Shin-un was standing opposite him. He was very confident in this fight because he knew he had the strength and ability to win. When members of other factions saw what had happened, they were surprised by who came to defend them, because a couple of months ago they would not have thought about it. Even members of the Red Clouds faction were frozen in their seats. They were silently watching what was happening around them. However, suddenly the deputy chief turned to them and shouted loudly with his mouth wide open that they should not give in to fear. Immediately after these words, his wards lined up behind the man, and the deputy continued to say that there were only 3 gifted competitors. Having listened carefully to this speech, the revived man calmly emphasized that it was immediately clear that they were all of the same field. After saying these words, the gentleman decided to scare his opponents a little bit and used mana. A purple light began to appear around him. The deputy of the Red Clouds was not at all afraid of this. On the contrary, he began to mockingly say, "What trick does the opponent have hidden this time?" As soon as Yu Shin-won used his powers, the man dropped his head and looked down in surprise and began to carefully examine what was moving toward him on the ground. The man still could not understand what it was, and it was already next to his feet. Then he asked a question out loud to find out what it was. Immediately after these words, something strange began to appear on the surface of this black liquid. And when the young man saw it, he just froze in place like a stone. When the creature stood up to its full height, one could see that it was dressed in a long black cloak, and its eyes glowed with a bright red light. His opponent from the Red Clouds faction had large bulging veins on his temple from excitement and fear. As it turned out, similar creatures appeared near the other members of the faction. Each of them had a weapon in their hands and was skillful with it. The black-clad attacker raised his sword without hesitation. He is ready to deal a fatal blow to his opponent because he does not have time to mess with them. The gift came just in the neck area, and so it became clear that the opponent was decapitated. All the blood splashes flew around. Then other black creatures did the same, and the bodies of the dead began to lie at their feet, and they looked at them silently, with their heads down. Yu Xinyun then turned to his black-clad men in a serious tone and ordered them to kill the remaining members of this faction. Hearing this order, the creatures rose into the air and began to follow those they needed. The members of the Red Cloud faction began to run in different directions. At this time, the two allies of Yu Xinyun began to think that this must be what the older gentleman was telling them, and now it was becoming clearer to them. It turns out that before he died, the father of the revived man hired the soldiers from the Death Gate to guard him. This is the most secretive group of assassins. During a meeting with his allies, Yu Xinyun explained to them that his father had fulfilled only one condition, and now these soldiers would protect him for a whole year. Instead of protecting his son, the father showed them the teachings of the art of the 12 Swords of Thunder, the art of the god of lightning and thunderstorms. At the time, the allies could not fully understand how a gentleman could give away his family's art for the sake of hired killers. After listening to his allies' statements, Yu Xinyun thought that he had just lied to them, but he could not explain the appearance and presence of the skeletons in any other way. After all, if you apply the phantom cloak he received in the last level to the skeletons, they can hide their bodies under it. Afterward, Yu Xinyun thought that he had to make it all up as he went along, because these events happened so suddenly. But it turned out to be pretty good. While the young gentleman was thinking about all this, everything was going well on the battlefield. His men were doing their job well. In a few minutes, they managed to deal with almost the entire faction, and when no one was left, they approached the pile of bodies and began to examine them carefully. Men from other factions began to discuss among themselves that this was probably their future lord's personal detachment. And these men began to raise their hands high and shout loudly that they had won, and then they added the phrase, "Glory to Mr. Yu Xinyun." However, this is not the end of the story today, as there are two more bastards to deal with. The building was already illuminated with purple light. The gentleman pointed to it and shouted loudly for everyone to follow the main leader of the Red Clouds faction, and everyone began to run quickly in that direction. Yu Xinyun, of course, was the first to go, and his allies ran on both sides, followed by the rest of the people. As soon as they got closer, a strange gray smoke began to appear in the air. However, this did not stop the attackers. As they got closer, the fog became thicker, but everyone continued to move at the pace they had been doing before. However, after a few minutes, when the fog was cleared, Yu Xinyun was left alone. And when he realized this, he stopped in his tracks and looked around, and they all suddenly just disappeared. After a few minutes of thinking, he came to the conclusion that it must be something like a valley of fog. Then the revived man raised his hand to his chin and realized that this development could be for the best, because if there are no extra eyes, he will be able to use all his power. Therefore, he turned to the stairs and began to walk toward them, thinking that everyone inside had brought death upon themselves. At this time, inside the room, Kavak began to worry that he could feel the energies of the attackers. He began to think about what could have happened outside. So he banged his hands on the table with anger and then leaned on it and began to speculate that they had killed even Hagyum. This simply couldn't happen because Kwok's plan had been thought out to the smallest detail, but he didn't understand why it had happened. It was an excellent decision to send ancient curses, knowledge of which disappeared decades ago, in a targeted manner, and it was definitely enough to win. However, the only detail he missed was the eldest son, Yu Xinyun. It was after his return that everything went wrong. So all that's left for Kwok at this point is to kill everyone here and wipe this place out. The world simply must not know about the existence of this cult, because if someone finds out, they simply will not survive and no one will help them. But he alone will manage to survive because no one can defeat him as long as his secret power is with him. At that moment, Yu Xinyun slowly began to descend the stairs into the center. He walked confidently and calmly. A sweet smile could be seen on his face. When he finally entered the center and looked around, he froze in his tracks because what he saw did not frighten him, but surprised him. When he saw the guru wrapped in white bandages, he emphasized that he thought they were all crazy, but this was just too much. Kwok decided to seize the opportunity and calmly addressed the revived man, asking him if he could offer him a deal. Without waiting for an answer, the man said with a single smile that he would make Yu Shin-un the head of the clan. But for this, the young man needs to prove his loyalty to the cult. And after these words, Kwok threw a sword in front of the revived man, which fell to the ground next to his feet. A few minutes later, he crouched down with his right hand and raised his weapon. When he did so, Kwok told him that if he went up and destroyed the rest of the clan, he would get all the glory. However, what happened next was not what Kwok had imagined. As soon as he got to his feet, the young man threw his sword right at him. And then finally, Yu Shin-won said that he was wondering when Kwok would finally shut up, but no, he kept talking and talking. This made the man very angry. He was out of his mind with rage. His eyes seemed to be bloodshot, and he opened them so wide that it felt like they were going to fall out. However, this did not scare him at all. After all, he is 100% confident in his abilities and capabilities. Then he pulled out his sword, which was already illuminated by a blue light, and said that it was enough to talk, and maybe we should get down to business. And then Kwok replied that he finally understood everything, because he wondered why this young man had started to behave so abruptly. And finally, he added that he would show him his true power. After saying these words, the man folded his hands as if in prayer and brought them to his mustache, which then began to move in circular waves in the air directly toward Yu Shin-won, who at that moment was standing a few meters away in a pose that in no way showed his fear. However, a thought flashed through my mind. Where did this man get so much strength from? After all, he did not know that he had it in such a quantity. And so he quickly and skillfully lowered himself to the floor and, with his hand on it, ordered his skeletons to stand up. Immediately after this order, the statues wrapped in white bandages also opened their eyes, which emitted red light. For several minutes, they just stood in their places, almost without moving. But the downward postures were very unusual for ordinary people. However, as soon as they received the nod from the chief, they immediately realized who the opponent was and who they needed to attack. When Yu Shin-won looked at the new opponents, he realized that they were zombies, but in this world, they are called Jianshi. Kwok wasted no time in ordering the zombies to attack and kill anyone who would interfere with them. And in a matter of seconds, the first clash occurred between them, where everyone tried to choose an opponent and fight with him. The skeletons used their swords that glowed with blue light. This helped them to see the parts of the opponent's body that they wanted to hit. Watching this fight, Kwok concluded that the opponents were using the liquid art of chaos, but it was all to no avail. Then one of the stronger skeletons pulled out his weapon and began to scrutinize the attackers who were approaching him. However, what he saw next surprised him a bit and made him freeze in one position. After all, he did not expect it to happen this way. However, the threat to his life still gave him signs, and he stabbed one of the attackers right in the heart. Several more zombies attacked him at the same time, and they just threw him on the floor and started climbing on top of him, causing him a lot of injuries and pain. Watching this battle, the young gentleman raised his eyebrows in anger, because it turns out that each of these zombies is at the level of the strength of a supreme warrior. Then he turned his gaze to the right and saw that the oldest skeleton was doing much better. He even managed to kill someone, and that was very pleasing. Then the guy turned his gaze to Kwok, and the thought dawned on him that the bastard was just trying to buy time. After thinking about everything that had happened for a few minutes, Yu Shin-won realized how he could destroy all of these zombies at once. So without wasting any time, he began to use magic. Seeing this, Kwok emphasized in his mind that the boy had become very good at concentrating his ki and wondered what he was up to. But he simply cannot let them win, because then life in the clan will become unbearable. All the zombies died in the positions they were in at that moment. After all, this magic was used against them, and they had already begun to feel the first signs. But then they all began to drop out one by one. And so far, everything was going according to Yu Shin-un's plan. Finally, he will be able to get rid of these impudent people, and his subordinates will survive. When Kwok saw this, he was very shocked, because he had not expected such a development. So he froze in place with his mouth and eyes wide open. However, there was no need to figure out what to do next. After all, from the outside of the building, you could see the orange light spreading through all the rooms very quickly. A few seconds later, there was a very loud and powerful explosion. Many fragments of the building were scattered in different directions, and what remained was engulfed in a large flame. As soon as everything was over, a group of black creatures could be seen on the side of the building, hugging each other. When they realized that the danger had passed, they began to slowly and carefully move in different directions to free themselves and relax a little. When they all dispersed, it turned out that inside they were protecting Yu Xin-woon, who began to cautiously get to his feet and cough. Shaking off his clothes, the guy began to look around, saying that it was a really big explosive power and it was quite dangerous. But they all managed to survive. And he thanked his subordinates for being safe, and especially the oldest of them because he had no injuries. Then the young gentleman went to a small promotion and turned to his assistants and asked where the bastard Quack had gone. And in his mind, he remembered that he had already seen such power in monsters from his previous life. However, a logical question arises as to how this old man was able to acquire it. However, these thoughts were interrupted by a small earthquake that occurred. Yu Xin-woon was not expecting it, so he barely stood up. For the first few minutes, it was not clear who was behind it. But the young gentleman did not give up, and still tried to find out, because it could harm them, and then his plan would be ruined. As it turned out, Quack came to the surface from under the ruins. He flew high into the sky, leaving a trail of purple light behind him. When he saw this, he hovered over them and began to laugh loudly and ominously. After all, he was not dead as his rivals thought. Then he showed his right hand, with which he demonstrated his power, and then he turned to the Lord and asked if he could see how these bastards were pierced by his power. Then he turned his gaze to Yu Xin-woon and asked how he had managed to do this. After all, this power is only available to blessed demon lords. This speech did not anger the young man. He was surprisingly calm and restrained. Raising his head up, the young man raised his right hand to his chin. And then he said that it was a pretty great speech, and it was very interesting, but it was too short. After all, he would have liked to hear much more than that. Such a calm reaction infuriated Quack, and he began to wonder if this guy had gone mad, although he was able to learn the long-forgotten art of blowing up corpses, for he is only a pawn in his path, an obstacle that he will destroy by sacrificing the Lord of Demons. But his body didn't seem to be deformed by the monster's appearance. At the same time, Quack continued to hover in the air, the revived man standing below to watch him. Then their eyes met, and each used it to show his confidence and power. But Odd Quack was out of his mind and body, from the rage that had taken over his mind and body. Then Yu Xin-woon began to smile sarcastically, rubbing his fists one by one. And then he said that he would come to a final conclusion when he had beaten all this nonsense out of his opponent. Quack's face changed in surprise. He hadn't been frightened by those words, but he hadn't expected this guy to try to attack him again. It took them both a few minutes for each to realize what they should do in this case, because each of them wanted to win for themselves and their assistants. A wide smile did not leave the young gentleman's face all this time, because he was 100% sure that he would succeed. Observing such emotions, Kovac tried not to give a sign of what was going on inside him, so he restrained himself and his emotions. However, inside, he was disturbed by thoughts. Why him? Why is he afraid of this bastard? After all, he also has a lot of strength to fight back with dignity. That's why he didn't show them to his opponent. Instead, he held his hands out to the side and slowly climbed up a little bit, saying that Yu Xin-woon had recognized the power of the Demon Lord himself. And after these words, Quack's body began to gradually dissolve into thin air, and he was smiling broadly because he believed that everything would go according to his plan. After all, he and his team spent so much time on all the preparation. So much money was spent on spreading their teachings, and so much effort was spent on training. The young gentleman folded his arms across his chest and silently watched with a serious expression on his face. But he was not just standing there watching, he was trying to guess what might happen next. After all, he had to warn everyone nearby about the danger. And then he suddenly felt that a bone wall was about to appear from the ground, so he quickly turned his head back to realize that it would not harm anyone. And right behind Yu Xin-woon, the same bone wall appeared in a second. It looked quite scary and was also as tall as the undead, who barely managed to dodge it. But she still managed to touch the arm of one of the impudent men. And it was not just a simple touch. She pierced it in several places, which later bled bright red. It turns out that it was Quack's right limb, who was looking at it with fear and could not understand what was happening. And then he realized that what was happening to him now had suspended his disappearance. And it scared him quite a bit, because he had already thought that everything was over. But I liked what happened to Yu Shinwun's rival, because they will be able to continue their showdown. And today, everyone will know for sure who won. But first, he had to assess what was happening around him and how he could use it to his advantage, because he had no time to delay and didn't want to. So I began to look around quickly, carefully considering every detail, looking for something that could help him. While he was doing this, a bone wall formed on his right side. This did not frighten or alarm the revived man at all. By this time, Kwok was already on the ground, and as you can imagine, he did not manage to disappear because his arm was pierced by the sharp tips of the bone wall. While he was looking at his bloody limb, he wondered how this was possible and how this young man managed to use such powerful magic. A few minutes later, Yu Shin-un approached Kwok, who, looking at his opponent's condition, began to smile broadly, emphasizing that everything turned out quite well. And then the man changed his face. His expression became sinister and his eyes bulged, and he said rudely that if the man had been a little to the left, he would have just gouged out his eyes. Kwok gathered up the courage to take his hand out of the bone wall. He was tired of all the events and asked the young master how he could do it so easily. Yu Shin-wun raised his right hand up and explained that when using low-level mist teleportation, there are always fluctuations in mana. And finally, he added that he just concentrated on it a little bit. However, the opponent could not believe that everything could be done so easily. And then in action, the man used the magic he had the strength to use and shouted with his mouth wide open that how dare he mock the demon lord. As it turned out, this magic was aimed at creating small swords from the fallen blood. After creating them, Kwok immediately pointed them at the revived man, telling him to die. Watching his weapon, the man smiled slyly, thinking that his opponent would try to block it, at least somehow. But Yu Shin-un did not take any noticeable action. He simply spread his legs wide to take a comfortable position, and as soon as she approached him, a few meters away, a barely visible white wall appeared. And it was because of it that he felt so confident and safe. As he stood there, he thought that no magical attack could break through the barrier of souls. After all, they are one of the most reliable defenders. When Kwok saw that his weapon had failed to fulfill its task, he began to say out loud that this was simply not possible. And then the man decided that since he could not wound the main man, he would absorb the blood of his assistants. And he immediately turned his gaze to them. Having studied this question, Kwok immediately stretched his right hand forward and used the last of his remaining strength to cast magic. In a matter of seconds, the blood swords were already approaching the skeletons, which continued to stand in the same position in place. When swords landed on their black cloaks, they did not do anything about it. They just stood there quietly, and Kwok couldn't understand why this was happening. After a few minutes, they started looking at each other, just to see what they were wearing. When Kwok saw that most of his swords were stuck in the creatures, he began to smile happily, because he was sure that his powers would return to him, and he began to use magic to gain strength from his opponents. However, in a matter of seconds, the man realized that something was wrong. He wondered how this was possible. As it turned out, this did not work on the skeletons at all. Instead, they began to pull out their swords to finally finish off this attacker. However, Kwok did not give up hope that he would still be able to get blood from these creatures in order to restore his strength, and to leave this place, at least to survive. When Yu Shin-wun saw what his opponent was trying to do to his subordinates, he began to think happily that he could do it, but in principle, he would get nothing. For a few more minutes, the man still tried to get what he wanted, but he failed, and he simply could not believe what was happening now. And while he was furious at his failure, Yu Shin-wun and his subordinate skeletons lined up in a single line in front of Kwok. Everyone touched it with their weapon and was able to launch a jet of magic at the demon lord, which would cause serious damage and further weaken the opponent. Kwok was definitely not expecting this, and so he didn't have time to react in time to the fact that a whole bunch of magical weapons were flying at him. However, in the last seconds, he realized that he could not escape from here. Therefore, he decided to first move to heaven, where they would not be able to reach him and harm him. And the man began to use the magic of dissolution in the air. But again, it did not happen as he had imagined. As it turned out, this obstacle was the main skeleton, who saw this and immediately went to Kwok to prevent him from doing what he planned. Even Yu Shin-un himself was surprised by this reaction. He folded his arms across his chest and watched his subordinate's actions with his mouth wide open. This warrior was able to repel the movement and thus prevented their opponent from escaping again. When he succeeded in doing so, the skeleton quickly got to his feet and turned his head to his master to show what he was willing to do to win. The survivor still couldn't come to his senses and understand how this old man could calculate the trajectory of Kwok's flight and shoot him down with such speed and still remain unharmed. The victim was still lying on the ground with his arms and legs spread wide apart. The man remained in this position for several minutes. A young gentleman came up to him and, looking at him, began to think about whether this was a temporary transition to another form and after the form became unstable. And then he said out loud that it would have been better if Kwok had used martial arts, and then maybe he would not have been hurt as badly as he is now. As he said this, the man began to slowly open his eyes. Seeing this, Yu Shinwun bent down a little lower and looked his opponent straight in the eye and asked him a question to find out if he really thought he could defeat him with the power of those bastards. Kwok first coughed, and this cough was accompanied by drops of blood that flew in different directions from him. The young gentleman asked a clarifying question. Did he really not know, or was he just fooling around? Without waiting for an answer, he said that he was talking about nebulous teleportation. And then he said that only a bastard like Kwok could use the power of the Vampire Lord. After all, he didn't have much power of his own, so he decided to take such drastic measures. After all, the power of the Vampire Lord allows you to increase your strength and create minions when you absorb their blood. However, if you summon him once, he stays with you. This animal is a real monster. It is also a cruel and strong monster that simply sweeps away everything in its path and does not care who stands in front of it. But for the revived one, he was just an annoying nuisance from the hunter's life. Since the vampire's abilities don't work on the undead, it was he who was mostly responsible for their destruction. So it was through this experience that Yu Shinwun realized that Kwok was using the powers of a vampire. And it took him less than 1 minute to realize this, so he's a master at this too. And then he added that in his past life, not a single ordinary person could use the powers of a monster because you need to be very strong both physically and morally. Because transformation is rage infection destruction, and someone wanted to try these powers, and ordinary people were constantly suffering because of it, but they could not fight on their own. Once there was an incident in one of the educational institutions where the main man turned to a boy standing next to him and asked him to run away because they were no longer his brothers and sisters. The young man froze in place, and tears began to flow from his eyes in 2 streams. Not understanding the director's words, he stood there almost without moving. The story won't continue because Yu Shinwun interrupts it on his own, because for him it's not a pleasant memory at all, so it's better not to watch it at all. Then he got down on one knee in front of Kwok, who was still lying on the ground, and correcting something on his face, he reasoned that monsters use only mana spoilage. And it seems that Kwok has stepped into a world beyond human existence. When the man heard this, he furiously began to say that he was not a vampire because it was the power of a demon lord. And in a matter of seconds, he opened his eyes and mouth wide and began to scream even louder than he had in thousands of years of waiting. He had chosen their blood sect. After receiving this confession, Yu Shin-un finally realized which sect everyone was talking about when they mentioned the demonic sect on Mount Tian. One thing is for sure, thousands of years of expectations mean that this sect has been gathering strength in the shadows for many years. Then the young gentleman decided that he needed to get some more information, but first, he needed to destroy the source of the opponent's Kai just in case. Then Yu Shin-un lifted Kwok by the throat above the ground and emphasized that all this pain was nothing compared to the pain of the innocents he had sacrificed. Suddenly, something strange caught the guy's attention and he squinted a little and began to look closely. And it turned out that there was some skin detachment in the neck area. So, without hesitation, the young man pulled the mask off his face. And behind it was a bloody man who did not expect to be discovered at all. Then Yu Shinwun froze for a few minutes as he tried to figure out who it was. And why was he hiding behind a mask? Kovk didn't say a word after being declassified. He just looked blankly at the young gentleman with his mouth slightly open. However, suddenly a strange memory arose in his mind. His whole body was bandaged with white bandages, and he looked like a zombie who could not control his body on his own. This gave the guy a headache, and holding on to it, he dropped his opponent to the ground so that he fell loudly and began to moan in pain. After a few minutes of quiet, Yu Shin-un realized that it was a memory of the previous owner of the body he was in now, and this alarmed him a little. Then pictures with memories began to appear again. Kwok addresses him with a big smile on his face, saying that they haven't seen each other for a long time. Then the man sat down on the large stone table where Yu Shinun's body was lying and said that before his death, he had been a complete fool. Instead, the man who came back to life just lay there looking at the ceiling, not even blinking. And his body color changed from pink to pale. Then Kovic took out the bell and, swinging it from side to side, said with a wide smile that it was returning as the only heir and would become the basis of the future of the blood sect. After these memories, the young man was surprised that he could feel Yu Shin-woon's emotions, and he finally understood why he saw that message about Jen from the future. There is an artistic version of these events where he is not reborn into the body of Yu Shin-woon, and the memories manifest themselves as time goes on as what the young man experienced after his death. So the man who came back to life grabbed Kwok by the hair and angrily called him a bastard and ordered him to quickly tell everything he knew about the sect because he could not vouch for himself. Then Kwok's face changed, as if he were grimacing from the pain that was pervading his entire body. A strange purple liquid began to flow from his nose and eyes. And then Yu Shin-woon realized that someone had set a trap on this man's mind, and if he did nothing, he would simply collapse. However, this trap acted so quickly that Kwok began to twist in different directions in pain and scream loudly. The revived man laid the man face down on the ground and held his head, trying to understand what was happening to him. And when he turned his gaze to Kwok, he was already lying there without any signs of life. Instead, a purple liquid continued to flow from his mouth and eyes and spread on the ground around him. Then Yu Shin-un sat down on the stairs a few meters away from the body and began to think sadly, that is there really someone so powerful in this world? Then the system began to issue messages one after another. One of them said that the monster had been destroyed and that the survivor would receive the maximum amount of experience as a reward. And this information made the young man think about the fact that Kwok was classified as a monster and not a human. And then the next question arises, what kind of freaks created this blood sect? At this time, Yu Shin-un's allies saw that the fog began to dissipate in front of them, preventing them from going further. So one of them called out to the warriors of all factions. The first members of the factions who saw the revived man addressed him as a future lord and emphasized that the building of the Red Clouds was completely destroyed. When the others joined the first ones, they began to smile with joy when they saw with their own eyes Yu Shin-un alive and unharmed because there were just ruins around. Then the men lined up in a row and raised their hands in the air and began to shout, "Future, sir!" And it was at this moment that the young man realized that it was better to concentrate on the present. So he opened his mouth wide and shouted with a serious expression that the battle was over, and at this point, their lives are not in danger. And finally, the guy raised his sword up above his head and shouted even louder that they had won, and they have nothing to fear from you. The group of men from different factions was quite amused by this, and they began to rejoice loudly for the fact that this is exactly what happened, and that they had such a defender. At this time, greenish lights began to appear on the walls of the mansion's basement. Some of them were smaller, others larger, but they were all connected. And then one of the sparks suggested that a monthly meeting should have been held long ago. Tai didn't like these words at all, so he said that if he said that to him again, he would break his neck. This threat only made the other man laugh. The third voice from the other light asked his comrades to finally calm down, because after all, they were now in the domain of the Demon Lord. Then Tai wondered why there were only 6 of them here, since the meeting time had long since arrived and no one new had joined them. And everyone began to think. Suddenly, another voice interrupted the conversation and said that they all understood that the cases of Commanders Jin and Gong were rather dubious. So we can start the meeting now. However, one said that he had one small problem. The others immediately asked what he meant. What problem? And then he began to tell me that there was an incident in Zhejiang. The reconnaissance unit he sent there was destroyed. Other interlocutors could not understand how this was possible. The voice went on to say that the investigation showed that the intelligence unit had been destroyed by a thunderbomb. And the voice said that one vice shaman and a group of blood warriors had been killed. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief because it was a small part of the whole army. Suddenly, the 2 friends began to laugh out loud, saying that such a powerful creature had been defeated by an unknown slug. And then the main voice asked everyone to take it responsibly. After all, until the time comes, the sex affairs must remain secret. However, at the end, one of the voices could not calm down. He was furious at what had happened, and therefore changed color from green to red. Several days have passed since Yu Shinun's victory, and many faction members have spent all their free time in local pubs drinking, eating, and having fun. One group of men said that one of the estates of the Baek-un clan had collapsed, and that Kwok, the youngest son, and the entire Red Cloud faction had disappeared. But this is not surprising, because it is a common coup within the clan. After these words, the other men asked the black-haired man to tell them everything he knew at the moment, because they were interested to hear it. And the man began to tell me that it all started when 3 of the 4 leaders of the clan faction elected Yu Shinun as the new chairman. But somebody put down all those who had risen, and this hero was the old son, Yu Shinun. He revealed his martial art and summoned the storm with one sword stroke. And in the end, Kovk was destroyed by a thunder bomb that was hidden in the Red Cloud mansion itself. The new lord even chained up Yujin-san, who was rumored to be a drug addict. After listening carefully, one of the interlocutors said that it was all a lie, especially about the art of the 12 swords. Then other friends started laughing and saying how this guy could do such a thing. These are just different rumors that someone made up and spread around the neighborhood. Then the man opened his mouth wide and said that he had heard that the Baek-un clan was in a nightmare. It's as if no one supports the eldest heir anymore. After these loud words, 2 young men approached the man and tapped him on the shoulders and asked if he wanted to go out and talk to them for a few minutes. When the man saw them, he froze in place, almost without moving. He did not expect that someone would come up to him in this place and call him to show him the ropes. But even if he hadn't agreed to go with them, they still pulled him out from under the table and were already beating him in the street, where it was already quite dark. When the victim was able to kneel down, he folded his hands in prayer and asked the boys to stop and let him go home. One of the boys folded his arms across his chest and asked the insolent man how he dared to humiliate their master like that. The man bowed his head low and said that he understood and would not do it again. So the boys allowed him to go home. As they stared after the impudent man, they began to talk among themselves about what they had already heard, as if the Huangrok clan was spreading bad rumors about them. This means that their clan is now on everyone's lips. Another guy said that this was not surprising because they had not yet accepted any commission. The young man added that he did not care what other people thought, because his faith was stronger than ever. Just thinking about the future of the clan makes his heart start to beat with joy. At this time, Yu Shinun sent his faithful assistant home because it was getting late. As he was leaving, he told the young man to get a good night's rest because he had been working so hard. Immediately after saying these words, the assistant turned to face the street and began to slowly walk down the stairs to go home and finally rest. Suddenly, he stopped and looked up at the sky with a sweet smile, thinking that his master had finally moved to the clan leader's mansion. And the long-awaited peace came. However, the assistant began to worry that 5 days had passed, and he was already running out of time to sleep. The logical question then arises as to what he has been doing for so long that he hasn't been resting. Instead, Yu Shinun was performing a certain ritual that took a lot of his energy. After all, it was necessary for him and the entire clan to feel safe. The young gentleman's appearance had changed a bit. He had lost a quarter of his weight, and now looked quite attractive, but very tired. But breathing a sigh of relief, he said that finally this blood sect had called off its spies, and it was very good that he reacted in time. Immediately after the victory over Kwok, Shinun replaced the memories of all the survivors with other events of the battle, the uprising of the Red Cloud faction, and the explosion of the estate. The new skill of manipulating memories had to be used for only one reason, despite the high cost of mana. Yu Shinun realized that the blood sect was a crazy, uncompromising, and cruel community. So if even one person spoke out, they would all be destroyed. But in any case, he bought them time. And now the target will not be the whole clan, but only him. So now he has used the return of one of his subordinates, who constantly helps him. And it was an employee whispering in the background. After all, he now has to provide new information and go on a new assignment, because they can't rest when they have so many problems. A few minutes later, a shadowy whisper began to enter the room through various cracks, which brought new information about all the events taking place in the clan. Yu Shinwun realized that if it weren't for this assistant, he wouldn't have been able to react so quickly to everything, and thus save all his subordinates. After all, since he became the boss here, it had become his duty. But he could not attach a shadowy whisper to all 200 members of the clan. Even the full 4th round of mana could not help him. And it was the mana stone of the vampire lord. It was the heart of a monster that was compressed into a sphere and holds a large amount of mana. The rank of the stone depends on the rank of the monster. Then the young man closed his eyes and began to use magic. A purple light began to appear around him. While he was doing this, he was thinking that he did not know why the monster stone fell out of Quack. And since the blood sect is such a secret organization, it would not think of attacking directly in the forehead. After the magic was applied, the young man began to stretch a bit because his whole body was sore. And before the time comes, he needs to become much stronger. And that's why he doesn't have time to rest, because he has to work hard. Then Yu Shinwun looked out through a small crack in the door and asked his skeleton guards not to let anyone in until he said so. As soon as Yu Shinwun returned to his room, he immediately decided to start working on increasing his strength. So, stretching his right hand forward, he ordered to open the pocket dimension, and a purple light began to appear around his hand, circling around, and he waited for the final result because not everything is done as quickly as he would like. The pocket dimension is a void formed between worlds. Only inanimate objects can be placed there, and the capacity of the dimension increases with increasing skill level. And in a few seconds, the measurement began to show a wooden handle, but it was not yet fully known what it could be. It turns out that it was a scythe of acid poison. It is a mystical artifact used by people in ancient times. It has great power and strength. Having held the weapon in his hands, the young man emphasized that it is much heavier than it looks, but it fits in his hands like a glove. Then the guy began to wave the scythe from side to side. Then he stopped and began to think about the phrase, anchored gifted, which is probably the name of the owner of this item. This element is responsible for the ability that is embedded within the weapon. So far, the young gentleman did not know how to study all this, so he decided to simultaneously intertwine Yinkimana with the art of the Oriental artist and the god of lightning. When he did, the bright, multicolored light from the weapon spread throughout the room, and he couldn't even hold the handle anymore. Then Yu Shinwun opened his eyes and looked at the scythe, thinking that he could feel the emotion of the weapon, and at this moment it was furious at what was being done to it. And then the young man came to the conclusion that this is a very strong object that has its own character, a living weapon, and it chooses its own owner. After reading these messages, the phrase natural energy made him think, because he didn't understand what it was. That's why he decided to discover the characteristics of the body, the natural body of a gifted person. Most gifted people are born with their own powers, but there are cases when the body of a gifted person is achieved through various kinds of training. So he began to look closely at the coma, thinking that although he had received it, it had not yielded to him, and now he needs to understand how to increase his energy. And while he doesn't know this, he decided to return it to its place to figure it out over time. As soon as he returned the scythe, he turned in the opposite direction, with his arms folded across his chest, and began to walk slowly around the room, thinking about all sorts of questions. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks and realized that he now needed to strengthen his combat power. After all, what he had might not be enough for the situation. So he turned again to face the purple circle that was still hovering behind him in the air, and he said that at last he would be able to get these guys. And then today, he had an opportunity that he just couldn't pass up. But first, he thought it over again so that he wouldn't regret it later. And then he calmly ordered them to come out. And in a matter of seconds, those he had been waiting for so long began to fly out of the hole. Then he looked down, and as it turned out, these were the bodies of the dead from the Red Clouds faction. For several minutes, he looked at them carefully, as if studying something. All of them were still wearing their red uniforms, but their faces had already changed, and their skin color was very pale. Although not much time had passed, then Yu Shinwun stretched his arms forward and began to smile sarcastically, saying that it was time to start what he had planned. And as it turned out, he used magic to create more than 20 medium-level skeletons from them. However, among these skeletons, one stood out because its bones were illuminated with blue light, while all the others were illuminated with purple. It turned out to be a skeleton sorcerer, the priest of the Zenith. After reading all the characteristics, the young man realized that this subordinate has very good strength and speed. Then the boy folded his arms over his chest again and turned to face the skeletons, thinking that all the fighting techniques these bastards knew were magical, so he couldn't use them right away. And then he remembered that if he was caught using magic, everyone he met would want to kill him. Then the young man lay down on his bed because he was very tired over the past few days. He just wanted to have a little rest from all the chaos that was happening to him. But it was not that simple. He took his small pillow, put it under his head, and looked at the ceiling with a concentrated look and said that it was time for the most important thing. And that is that in order to learn as much as he can about the blood sect, he needs to restore Yu Xinwun's memories. And right now, that's what he has to do. Closing his eyes, the man again saw a black and white image from his memories. In it, Kwok was sitting with 2 branches of cherries and telling the young man that he would soon become the head of the blood sect. However, nothing further happened. He could not understand how to remember everything. After all, he could not make out the most important part as if it had been deliberately blocked. And as soon as the young man used this skill, his eyes opened sharply, but there were no pupils. Instead, the entirety of his eyes were white. Then the young man closed his eyes tightly, and his soul was able to leave his body. In order to fulfill the next task, this required a lot of energy and mana. Yu Xinwun was very happy that he had managed to do it. He hadn't even expected to do it so quickly. Therefore, his soul decided to move as quickly as possible to the goal. However, some strange feeling did not allow him to work calmly because everything looked somehow ominous, as if he would regret what he had done later. Looking at him carefully, the young man thought that he felt as if he would be in a place from which he would not be able to escape. But he can't let his fear get the better of him, so he will do everything he can to make sure that he and his employees are happy. And bending down, the soul rushed into the body of Yu Xinwun. It was lying on a large wooden bed, showing no signs of life. When they began to combine, the young man suddenly opened his eyes and began to scream loudly because it was a sharp, unbearable, and unexpected pain. Instead, this did not stop the soul from moving on. After all, there was no going back, only forward to get the information he needed, which could help him in the future. But Yu Xinwun himself was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding his head and saying that it hurt him a lot. Therefore, in the memories, the soul found itself in the middle of a shallow pond, and it was so large that not a single piece of land was visible around it. Then the guy looked down and saw a reflection that surprised him. It made him freeze in place and hardly move because he had not expected such a turn of events. Opposite him stood a handsome young man. He had short black hair. He was dressed in a classic stylish suit. The young gentleman with wide open eyes looked at his reflection in detail and could not understand why it was there.